Digital transformation at PepsiCo, the future of work predictions for 2023, finance transformations, and the future of supply chain management. Those are just a few things we're going to talk about here on episode number 98 of Transformation Ground Control.
This is Transformation Ground Control, your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 98. My name is Eric Kimberling, CEO of Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent consulting firm that helps clients through the world with their digital transformation journeys. And I'm here, as always, with Cheatham, my co-host on the podcast here today. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, as always.
Great to have you. And episode number 98 is here today. You can find new episodes of the show every Wednesday on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as all the audio podcast platforms. Be sure to follow us on social media as well. You can either follow Kyler and myself individually, or you can follow Third Stage Consulting on all the major social media platforms where we post useful information on a daily basis. So be sure to check us out there. And exciting podcast episode for you today. We're going to cover some hot topics where we talk about the digital transformation at PepsiCo. We're going to talk about 5 strategies to network transformations. And we're also going to talk about predictions for 2023 as it relates to the future of work. So that'll be an interesting thread there. And then later in the show, we're going to have Chris King on the show. He'll be our first guest, and he's going to be with us talking about finance transformation versus digital transformation and just some general best practices for helping ensure that your finance and or digital transformation is successful. He's going to be coming at it more from a CFO's perspective, though. He's grown up in the finance space. He's founded a company called Transformative CFO, and his job is to help CFOs lead transformations in their organization. So we'll sort of take more of a finance angle to transformation, although most of the lessons we'll get to are going to be relevant to any sort of digital transformation. And then last but not least, we're going to play, Kyler, your choice or your third of 3 choices of your top 3 favorite interviews for 2023, and a very timely seasonal one where we talk about the future of supply chain management and logistics with Blythe Brumleve, who was on the show a few months ago. And in that clip that we're going to replay for you, it's very relevant and timely given that seasonality is something we talk about in that interview. And seasonality, of course, is something that's very important at the end of the year with end-of-year holidays throughout much of the world affecting supply chain. So be sure to stick around for that third segment later in the show. But before we get to our guests, let's talk through some of these hot topics you've got for us, Kyler.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with kind of the lens of digital transformation at PepsiCo. So to just give you a little background on anyone that doesn't know, they are going through a digital transformation. They actually brought in a new CIO as well to kind of lead the team that's actually from a digital transformation background. So definitely a more modern CIO. And so basically what the company is doing is they're looking to refine data analytics and deploy advanced manufacturing using IoT devices, as well as AI-enhanced robotics. A lot of smart manufacturing, smart floors, like we've seen in other areas of digital transformation and in manufacturing. And one thing I wanted to talk through that they've found success with is specifically the use of upskilling their workforce for the future of digital transformation. And just to share some baseline metrics, the digital overhaul of PepsiCo's business processes and operation has definitely contributed to the company's growth, which was the expected growth in 2022 is 12%, which if you remember in food and beverage, they haven't really had a huge shift, specifically with the pandemic and challenges in manufacturing there. But it's something that they've utilized this new technology to move into more of a high growth model. So some of the questions that they've found in going through the digital transformation is just the overall sustainability and viability of long-term automation within its current roles within the organization, roles and responsibilities. So what they did is instead of going through a large layoff or a huge restructure, PepsiCo, which employs about 300,000 workers across the globe, is transforming all of its human capital into a digital era. So they are actually launching PepsiCo Digital Academy, which provides employees with a foundational understanding of the value of data analytics and how they use it in their day-to-day basis. It launched last year, and over 30,000 employees have participated in the digital training, with almost 150,000 views on the digital training content. So it's almost like user adoption on steroids and taking it to the next level of upskilling employees. And they found a lot of success with this in just overall growth. From a baseline ROI perspective. So wanted to get your thoughts on that and really understand from a next level of utilizing your existing workforce in the transformation to create efficiencies, and then also basically overhaul your entire culture into more of a digital native opportunity.
Well, I think it's super fascinating, especially for an organization that has 300,000 employees. That's always going to make things a bit more difficult, and you're going to have more headwinds typically in a larger organization like that. But I think it's great that they're thinking about just changing the culture and upskilling. I'm a big fan of internal upskilling, not only because it helps develop your employees and gives them a longer term career path, but also because for organizations going through transformations in general, it makes them more self sufficient and they have more ownership and more control over the project. And the less upskilled a team is, or the less sophisticated a team is in terms of understanding operations and business and transformation in general, the more likely are to fall into the trap of outsourcing or having that outsource mentality if you don't have the right skills in house. And so you want to find that right balance. You can't be an expert in everything. You oftentimes do need outside consultants, and it may sound strange, us being consultants, for me to say don't become too dependent on consultants, but that's definitely something that organizations like Pepsi or any big company or any organization for that matter needs to be mindful of. So I think them having that upskill mentality is something that will probably serve them well. Sounds like a pretty big transformation, though. A lot of moving parts to that transformation. So I'll be curious to learn more over time. How that's structured and how they're managing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So their new CIO is actually from Accenture. So she came over. She was the chief data and analytics officer at Accenture and moved to PepsiCo. So obviously to drive that initiative, they've been involved in the transformation for 5 years. I couldn't find a ton of information on systems or other like real tactical approaches, but sounds as though they're really taking a people first approach and investing a lot into that user adoption and change management overall strategies. So definitely something that is good to see on a high level from a large brand.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's something to keep an eye on over the next few years. I assume it's not going to end anytime soon, and it'll be an ongoing journey, but be interesting to learn more as they
Yeah,
continue.
absolutely. I feel like my spidey senses a video.
Yeah,
So
right.
in the future from
Good
Eric
idea.
Kimberling.
I'm taking notes right now.
There you go. So the next thing I wanted to talk about today is the idea of network transformations. So a lot of what we talk about is digital transformation holistically, but when we look at a network or a network of operations to modernize and really create an intelligent, healthy business through technology, networks have become something that is no longer a real nice to have, but a must have and an efficiency model that is needed. So I have 5 strategies here that I found from an article that I wanted to share to unleash network transformation and kind of get your more technical idea of what it looks like to transform your network. And basically what we're talking about here for some of our not as technical listeners, because I'm not as technical, but we're looking at a new digital infrastructure stack that's completely overhauling existing infrastructures or infrastructures and disrupting operations to create growth and to stay competitive. And that's really the point of this article, is now a network transformation or a sophisticated digital operations network is absolutely needed to be on the cutting edge of staying ahead of a competition or a competitive advantage. And it also is the catalyst to growth, which we know a lot about in the use of emerging technologies and being able to actually leverage them within the business environment. These types of infrastructures and foundations are needed. So the first one is advanced operational flexibility with private 5G. So they argue there's really no alternative to private 5G for low latency, high speeds, and connectivity within critical enterprise operations. The next is increased responsiveness with edge computing. And we've talked a little bit about edge computing, but basically edge computing brings the best decision-making capabilities to the point of the digital interaction. So it's the point where the data is captured and then how it's reported throughout the organization. Improve scalability with cloud networking. So when we look at digital transformations, moving IT assets and networking to the cloud, which we talk a lot through either private or public cloud. And then build security. That's obviously a huge one, to be able to understand the security openings or any sort of risks involved in networks. And then last is to increase performance with AI operations and management. And again, that goes back to that holistic operations management with predictive maintenance and things like rapid reconfiguration capabilities. So a bit more technical than we really go, but the goal of this overall article is saying develop a network transformation plan. And that's really what I wanted to get your insight and feedback on, because it sounds like gone are the days of kind of a more siloed, not connected network. And we see that in the same with systems, in that interoperability piece that we talk a lot about. So wanted to get your feedback on if you think that that's going to be a main trend, or if it already is going forward in what you do with clients.
Yeah, I think it will be, and it's a good reminder for those listening that might be thinking, because I'm moving to a cloud solution, I don't need to worry about infrastructure or networks. And the reality is you do, especially if you have operations that might be dispersed throughout the world, or in remote parts of the world where internet connectivity, for example, is not that great. I mean, you need to be looking at the overall network of your infrastructure to make sure that it can enable some of the cloud technologies that you might be deploying, assuming that you're deploying cloud technologies. So I think that's first and foremost is a reminder that you do need to look at that piece of it. And also, it's important to understand sort of what you have in your current landscape before you go into a transformation. A lot of times when we're helping organizations with their implementation planning, or even before that, when we're helping them select the technology or technologies that are going to be the best fit for their organization, a lot of times they don't fully understand what systems they have, which may sound bizarre, but a lot of organizations don't have a handle on what all is out there being used, including those, below the radar, black market sort of systems that weren't approved necessarily by corporate, but someone went out and, bought some sort of technology, or even just spreadsheets and information being stored on local machines. Just understanding where all the data is, where all the systems are, what systems you have, what the inventory is, as well as the infrastructure and the network, and understanding the big picture of how you're going to replace that. That's all really important. So I think it's something that will continue to be an emerging trend as as transformations continue into the 2020s here.
And what do you think about kind of the private 5G or even the private cloud idea? I know we talk a little bit about that. Do you think that will kind of be more mainstream as we see that migration really become more sophisticated?
I think so, especially for differentiating competencies and business processes within an organization where they may not want to water down their competitive advantage in the name of a SaaS or a public cloud sort of a multi-tenant scenario. I know SaaS providers like system provider or software providers that are SaaS will tell you, no, SaaS is more scalable, SaaS is cheaper, or whatever. That might be true, but it also might completely undermine and water down your competitive advantage, in which case a private cloud gives you sort of the best of both worlds, where you're still leveraging the benefits of cloud, but you're also having the benefits of having your own instance, your own systems that you can do whatever you want with. You don't have to worry about the fact that it's SaaS or multi-tenant, or in other words, being used by other organizations in that same capacity. So yeah, I think it is something that's I'm a fan of, and I think I see a lot of situations in the world where organizations should be, maybe looking more at private cloud instead of just multi-tenant SaaS or public cloud.
Yeah, definitely an interesting consideration when going through the evaluation process, and something that a lot of times, we haven't discussed in the past, but is becoming something that is absolutely a necessity of that total network operating model within an organization, because we know technology is truly the backbone of business operations now. So definitely a very interesting time to be in the space.
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about future work predictions for 2023. So this is from the International Data Corporation, and they recently announced their future of work predictions for 2023 and beyond. So this overall study utilizes trends in the marketplace, and they made 10 predictions of work and its overall framework for technology related initiatives in the years ahead. So I thought we could go through those and then talk about a few that stood out to us. But I want to read each one because I do think that they're really interesting observations. And they focus on IT, HR, other line of businesses, decision makers, and influencers in technology. So prediction 1 is to address health, sustainability, travel, and other disruptions. 30% of organizations will adopt third-party metaverse conferencing tech solutions by 2027. Prediction 2 is by 2024, the business developer role will be obsolete, with more than 60% of enterprise training and support businesses using their own applications and automated processes using low code tools. So very similar to that user adoption that we've kind of seen Pepsi moving towards a little bit in our first example and case study.
Yeah.
Prediction 3 is driven by skills shortages. CIOs that invest in digital adoption platforms and automated learning technologies will see 40% increase in productivity by 2025, delivering greater speeds to enterprises. By 2024, this is prediction 4, by 2024, organizations deploying employee micro-monitoring measures, camera and keyboards, will see a 20% decrease in actual employee productivity.
Interesting. So it's going to backfire, is what you're saying.
Guys, I guess that big brother approach, I guess, is not going to work out for them. But who knows?
That's interesting.
Yeah. Prediction number 5 is companies that deploy reactive and tactical hybrid work models will see a 20% revenue loss in 2024 due to job attrition and underperforming teams.
What's it called? Reactive what? I missed that.
You're really going to make me say it again? No, I'm not.
Or
companies that deploy reactive and tactical hybrid working models. So to me, that means that it's not strategic; it's more reactive.
I see.
And it is. And anyone else in the comments right now, if you feel like that's a different and just in the comments in general, if you want to tell us your predictions and interact with us too. But by 2022, due to job attrition and underperforming teams, they'll see that 20% revenue loss.
Interesting. That's a pretty big impact, negative impact.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. And pretty staggering. And we can talk about them when we're all done. I'll keep going. But by 2025, organizations that have created dedicated hybrid security policies and developed a culture of trust will be 3 times less likely to suffer a security breach.
Okay. That one makes sense. I kind of see where they're going there.
Prediction number 7, almost there, team. Hold on. By 2024, companies offering frontline workers democratized access to digital collaboration, process automation, and similar tools will see a 20% increase in revenue due to improved productivity.
Okay.
Prediction 8, and you can tell an academic wrote this because they're really, my vocabulary is really on the
That's
high side.
funny you say that, because I was just going to say, who wrote this? It sounds very academic. That's why I'm having trouble tracking some of it, because it's
I,
so a lot of
yeah,
buzzwords, a lot of
right.
academia, but it's still interesting.
So, prediction number 8, holistic and integrated analytics with an intelligent digital workspace. They call it IDW ecosystem will drive 70% increase in business outcomes for adopters by 2026.
Okay.
Number 9, effective blurring space and place by 2025. 65% of companies will consider online presence to be a partial in real life access to their engaged workforce. So I think this is a very, because I read this one like 4 times, a very fancy way of blurring the lines between space and place within metaverse type of being involved and engaging in your work. It's in real life is their quotes.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds a lot like that first one you mentioned that was
Yeah.
about metaverse.
Yep. And prediction number 10, by 2024, 55% of C-suite teams at a global enterprise will use intelligent space and capacity planning technology to reinvent office locations for gathering, collaborating, and learning.
Another metaverse-ish
Yep.
sort of angle there. They seem to be pretty keen on the future of metaverse and some of the physical and augmented reality or
Mm-hmm.
digital experiences, kind of combining those two worlds. I think they might be a little aggressive in their expected time frame for when,
Yeah.
because a lot of them were like 2024, 26, 27. That seems pretty early for me to see that, actually taking hold. I think it might be further out than that. I also think one thing that jumped out at me is some of those use the word staggering on that 20% revenue drop for, what was it, for
Yeah.
organizations that don't.
There were a variety of 20% revenue loss or revenue increase too. So I don't know the actual data behind that. But yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's it seems exaggerated in my opinion. I don't know either where the data came from, or obviously it's a prediction. So I can't imagine there's actual real data to support their hypothesis here, other than just looking at maybe historic trends or whatever. But yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I think some of these predictions, when you get out there and look at some of these really cutting edge and bleeding edge technologies, it's really hard to make predictions on them, because half of these technologies might be obsolete. They might not ever catch traction and might disappear. We've seen that over time. And there might be others where they're right and they are going to have a material impact on organizations. So it's very interesting for sure.
yeah, I think there's a few in here. When you kind of wade through all the fancy language that I probably butchered, there's a few in here you can really pull out. I think prediction number 3 specifically, CIOs that invest in digital adoption platforms and
Yeah.
automated learning. I don't know, again, that 40% increased productivity. That's a lot, just depending on the size of your organization. But I do think that will be a main trend. I know you talk about the importance of digital adoption platforms and user adoption strategies going into specifically digital transformation, but just creating that more digital culture. I think that's definitely a big one as well.
Yeah, I agree. That is a very relevant one. I think
Mm-hmm.
I like the ones that are a little bit more tangible. Like
Me
there's
too.
something tangible now that you can see, and tech or digital adoption is something. There's tools out there now that are gaining traction pretty quickly. They don't seem as far fetched as some of the other ones.
Yes, and then prediction number 6, I think, is definitely a real trend that we'll see by 2025. Organizations have created dedicated hybrid security policies and developed a culture of trust. I think that culture of trust really hits home in explaining the importance of the employee level cybersecurity, and creating that ownership is going to be huge for companies to lower and mitigate any risks around security breaches. So I think that's a good one too.
Although I will say you don't want to create too much trust, because if you're too trusting, that's how you get into cybersecurity breaches or phishing scams or whatever. So I think it's a double-edged sword in some ways.
You always got to go to the dark side, don't you?
I know. Yeah, the pessimist in me.
Just joking. No, absolutely. Definitely a good thing. But curious to hear from our audience. So if you did have any predictions that you feel like really resonated with you, or something that you've heard kind of as dialogue in the industry marketplace, please share. I think these are always interesting to keep a pulse on. And it is, again, the International Data Corporation, the DIC, that put out this study. So data-based as well. So, but all good things. I mean, to kind of start going into 2023, very timely right now to be able to understand what we're looking for as far as the future of the workforce, or the future of specifically technology in work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd also be curious to hear in the comments below if what your thoughts are on some of these metaverse related predictions. Do you think those are going to be real? Are you seeing maybe some use cases in your own organizations, or if you're a consultant, maybe you're seeing some use cases there? It's one of those fascinating areas, and obviously these authors of this study are semi-fascinated by it too, because I think at least three of the 10 predictions are somehow related to metaverse and augmented reality and whatnot. So be curious to hear the audience's perception or opinion about metaverse and where they think that's going to go. So good predictions. Well, that's kind of a good lead in here as we close out, or start to close out 2022, is to look at 2023 and where the future of work is headed. So that's super interesting there. Well, good. Well, thanks for those hot topics there. We're going to shift gears a bit, and we've got two guests coming up on the show. First, we're going to have Chris King coming up next, who is with a company called Transformative CFO, and he's going to talk about finance transformation versus digital transformation with me, and we're going to dive into that discussion. And then later in the show, we're going to have Blythe Brumleve, who's going to be on to talk about the future of supply chain management and logistics, and we'll talk about seasonality and some other relevant topics as it relates to supply chain management here at the end of the year. So stick around for that as well. But we'll have Chris King talking about finance transformations first. But before we do that, we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back. Hi, this is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we recently hosted our Digital Stratosphere 2022 virtual event. It's 3 days of packed content related to digital transformation best practices, about 16 or 18 different workshops and different speakers that are presenting on different topics, everything you need to know about transformation. The bad news is if you miss that event, the event's over. The live event already happened. But the good news, if you've missed it, or even if you did attend it and you want to see replays, or you want to catch the sessions you missed, you can do that now by going to stratosphere2022.com. Go to stratosphere2022.com, register. All you have to do is put in your name and email address, just a few fields. You get immediate access to all the recordings, and the recordings cover everything from digital strategy, software selection, organizational change, process improvement, architecture, data migration, cloud, trends in the industry, how to avoid failure, some of the legal aspects to think about, contractual aspects to think about as it relates to your transformation. All that is stuff that you'll get by registering for Stratosphere 2022 replay. And again, go to stratosphere2022.com and you can listen to all the replays of all the workshops that you might have missed at the event. So hope you check it out, and thanks for listening. We'll see you soon. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 98. You can find new episodes of our show every Wednesday on audio podcast platforms throughout the world, as well as LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, where it streams every Wednesday. So be sure to check us out there. And you can also go to our YouTube channels to go back and listen to past episodes of the show. And of course, if you're listening on the audio podcast, you can access those historic episodes as well. So I'm excited for our next guest. He's actually a former client of Third Stage. He was actually one of the very first. Actually, he was the very first client. He worked for the organization that was our very first client as Third Stage back in 2018 when we started the company. So actually didn't make that connection until just this moment. I didn't even think of that when I invited him to the show. I knew him as a previous client. He's become a friend over the years. and someone I admire and enjoy working with. So I thought it'd be good to have him on the show. But with us today is Chris King, who's the CEO of Transformative CFO. He's also the founder of that company. And we wanted today to talk about a CFO's perspective on finance transformations versus digital transformations. So, Chris, thanks for being here today.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me on your show, and thanks for everybody joining us from all over the place. For me, it's early morning. Hopefully, I'm awake enough. I know for some of you, it's evening. So,
yeah, Chris is. I was telling Chris before we went live here that he's the first guest that I've had on this live stream that's on the U.S. Pacific time zone, which makes it very early for him. So, thank you for being here. You have the distinct pleasure of being the earliest morning person and guest on this live stream.
All right. Glad to do it.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And tell us a little bit about your background. I mentioned that you're a CFO. You're the founder of Transformative CFO. Maybe tell us about your background and what Transformative CFO does.
Yeah, thank you. There's kind of three areas for my career, I think, where finance transformation has evolved for me. I started really most of my career I've spent as a CFO or other senior finance executive, where I've gone in and inherited teams that I sometimes felt were not everything they could be, and I felt could operate at a higher level, and I led them through a transformation to just really get to where they were doing their best work. In my most recent finance executive role, I had the luxury really of being a VP finance transformation, where I could really focus on that. It was a large organization with a finance team that was spread between the US, Europe, and Asia. And it was a multi-year effort to really focus on that. And in that role, I really felt like I was coming up with a strategy for finance transformation, coming up with principles for a finance transformation, and doing something that I felt was repeatable. It was very successful there. And when I left there, I started just writing about it at transformativecfo.com as kind of a blog site. As I was thinking through the idea of kind of going in and becoming a consultant. And I've now done that and created Transformative CFO LLC and starting to serve clients. And just really, I'm interested in just sharing this stuff as I'm doing with you today, because I feel like it's really something that can impact company performance by impacting finance organization performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, it's probably worth noting that's how you and I met, was when you were in
Right.
that VP of finance role. You were a client of Third Stages, and that's how you and I got to know each other. And
Exactly.
now you're a consultant as well, focusing on the finance transformation sides of things. So you've had, just to clarify a bit about your background, you've had roles that are focused on finance transformation, like the VP of finance role you just described, but you've also sort of been in that frontline finance CFO or other types of roles as well. Is that right?
Absolutely. I've been a CFO of both publicly traded companies as well as startups. I've been global controller, I guess, was chief accounting officer for a New York Stock Exchange company. So I've really seen kind of that heavy SOX environment, that more innovative startup environment, and a lot of stuff in between.
Great. Well, good. Well, good to have you here. Before I jump into the initial questions I have, and again, any questions from the audience, we'd love to hear questions you might have for Chris and I as we go here. But just want to turn to the audience here. Thank you for those that chimed in on where you're from. We have people joining from Denver, Grand Forks, North Dakota, Orange County, California. So you're not the only person from California that's up bright and early here today, Chris. Maybe they can commiserate with you. Austin, Texas, Hereford, UK are just a few examples of where people are joining from today. So thank you for chiming in on where you're joining from today. So I guess just to start the conversation and just to start to unpack this a bit, Chris, what are the major differences between finance transformation and digital transformation? To me, they sound somewhat similar. In many ways, they are similar. But how would you describe the similarities or differences between those two terms?
Yeah, I mean, probably you have to first acknowledge the fact that both digital transformation and finance transformation mean different things to different people, and they're big buzzwords that are out there quite a bit. I think in your practice, you've done a really good job of emphasizing digital transformation as being about more than just technology and focusing on people and process and change management. And that's one distinguishment, because I think you could look at, some people would call finance transformation simply a digital transformation of finance. Some people think of digital transformation of taking products and services and making them digital for the first time. Others would say, it's about implementing technology that changes your operations, or both. So finance transformation, I like to think of as really covering people, process, technology, data, and information to really make the whole finance organization better. I would suggest that really adding technology is something best done towards the end of a finance transformation when you've done some of the other work.
Right. And yeah, that's a great point. So it's more of an enabler of doing some of that other work. What are when you think about finance transformations and some of that other work, some of that pre-technology work that you're talking about, what are some of the business benefits that organizations oftentimes realize from finance transformations? And then we can kind of come back to, what are some of those pre-technology things that we should focus on to enable the improvements? But what are the general benefits and business areas of improvement that you've seen that to be sort of the low-hanging fruit, the biggest areas of value within finance transformations?
So let me address that a couple different ways. Maybe the first thing I'd say is when you sort of define that finance transformation is when have I transformed, right? If I'm doing a finance transformation, when have I actually transformed my finance organization? And I'd say at that point when each team within finance has a clear idea of what better means, and they're able to measure it. So they've got some metrics that measure whether or not they're getting better. And then they have some initiatives that are designed to act on those measures, right? You now have an organization that really is focused on, how do we improve? So then you get down to kind of what does better mean? And I think one way to get everybody with the right clarity for sort of long-term objectives is to think about if we were to say we were better than another finance department or better than we were last year, what would better mean? How would you measure that? And my sort of 5 items that I come up with there and think about is that you would either say that we have more timely information, so we do our month-end close faster maybe. We have more insightful analysis, so we can impact the business and its strategy a little bit better. We're more accurate, there's fewer errors happening. We're more efficient, just the operations are more efficient. We have less people than we used to, or we have more time spent on transformation activities than we used to with the same number of people, which is what I experienced. I'll talk about that. Or it's more reliable. We have kind of better controls or less risk or something. But really, you'd have to kind of be on one of those measures. And so I think those are good like ways to anchor your kind of longer term objectives and then figure out what's most important. So those are kind of benefits generally. I think you could improve on any one of those 5. To be more specific, in my last role, we saw a 40% improvement in operational efficiency. So people went from spending all of their time doing their day-to-day job and getting their tasks done to spending about 40% of their time on finance transformation initiatives and just things to improve it and move those metrics forward. We reduced overdue accounts receivable by transforming that group by over 50%. We reduced the month-end close from 7 or 8 days down to 4. So that gets into that more timely information. How quickly am I helping people to steer the ship? On the FP&A side, we implemented driver-based forecasting and changed the way we were sharing information with BI, right? And really drove a significant improvement in the performance of the company. So I think all those types of benefits and kind of whatever's most important, you're really creating this mechanism where whatever is most important to improve, we have a good structure and mechanism for improving it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it seems like compared to other functional areas within organizations, finance is one of the areas where you have the most immediate tangible value that could be achieved, not just on the efficiency side, which you mentioned, but also some of the other things you mentioned, like improving your AR and accounts payable and things of that nature, or maybe not accounts payable so much, but more AR. And so that has immediate cash tangible value that organizations can point to.
AR is just this amount of capital that's sitting there not really doing anything, and we completed this effort and then brought in $20 million that had just always been kind of wrapped up in AR. We decreased that. About half of that came from overdue and half of it actually came from the current and just collecting that even faster. And that's $20 million you can reinvest in new product lines and acquisitions and other areas of the business, right? And start really getting a good return on that.
Yeah, it's not a small number for sure. And that's interesting too, because there's the intangible strategic value, of course, as well. But what about you mentioned that technology is an enabler, and there's a lot of other stuff that you would typically do before putting technology in place to get some of these improvements that you talked about. If you had to just sort of estimate, what percentage of the value that you typically see in a finance transformation comes from technology versus all the other stuff, operating model, the way you organize, your future state business processes, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think every organization, unless you really have done it, unless you're really a lean organization or have that type of process optimization going on, there's probably a lot more opportunity to improve your outcomes through process improvement, and through developing your people than there is just new technology. And there's a temptation as a CFO to want to just write a check to somebody and just improve things. I'm not happy with what things are. Who can I pay, right? What technology system integrator, who's going to make my organization better? And it's really kind of a I've really seen no evidence that works. Like the
Right.
reality is, if you want to make your organization better, you have to lead it. You have to develop your people and do the process work. We spent a lot of time on just kind of introducing lean and doing process improvement workshops. And we really took every process within finance, and we do a couple hour workshop where we'd map that out and we'd identify all the opportunities for improvement. And once you've done that, you've created this mechanism where implementing technology is going to be much more successful, because I know exactly how my process works, what the outcomes are that I'm getting from it, and whether or not I'm happy with them, and what those roadblocks are. And if I can then identify what's really wrong with my existing technology at kind of a root cause, then I know exactly what I want the new technology to do that the old one couldn't. But I think it's more often that people are struggling with other problems. It's not so much the capability of the technology that they have that's the problem. It's the way they've configured it, the way they've implemented it, or it's bad data, or it's just the way it's being used. A lot of times, I mean, the reality is, I'm sure you've seen this, where the way that people have learned to use a system is not the most efficient way to do it. It's not the way maybe that the implementer intended them to do it. Or, I would do these process improvement workshops where I'd bring in somebody from the IT side and the finance system side while we were mapping through the thing, and they would hear how people were using it and what a struggle it was and how inefficient the old system was. And they kind of say, why are you doing it that way?
Right.
But,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And you were dealing, your most recent role before you started Transformative CFO, the role where you and I met, you were involved in a multinational finance group too. And that I imagine adds another layer of complexity and opportunity too, because there's a lot of inefficiencies in terms of redundant processes and redundant functions and things of that nature.
right.
Maybe talk a little bit about that. What should a multinational finance group and organization be thinking about that's a little bit different than a single location one?
Yeah, I mean, one of the areas that we really focused on was just the harmonization of those processes. So we would do the same process improvement or process mapping workshop in both the US and the UK. And then we'd take the process maps and kind of line them up and compare them. And we had this kind of open house for a while where we'd take all the process maps from the US and we'd put them on one layer in a conference room, and all of them from the UK that matched up to it just below it. And we did the same thing in the UK, and then invited people to go in and kind of look at it and come up with ideas they had for improving it. But our goal there was to identify those differences and kind of determine, is there a good reason why we have differences? In some cases, those two organizations have different stakeholders that have different requirements, or the businesses are a little different, and therefore, there's a good reason for it. In other cases, and much more frequently, it's just two different people thought of the right way to do something long ago, and they've been doing it that way ever since, and it's different. But because it's different, you get away from the ability to sort of standardize it and optimize it and get consistent results in both places. You get a team that doesn't understand how the other team's doing it because they're doing it differently. It's much easier to collaborate with your colleagues across the Atlantic if you guys are both doing a similar process in a similar way. And then one of those ways is probably more efficient than the other. And if you really get everybody open to learning from each other and really searching for best practices instead of defending the way they do it, then you really, start to get people kind of questioning the way they're doing that. Why don't we do that? And we saw a lot of that. And ultimately, we harmonized processes at least, and in many cases, we harmonized groups and created a global group with a single global leader out of it. Even though what we started with was really a US CFO, an international CFO, India CFO, and separate organizations within each.
Yeah, I imagine that was a cultural shift as well. Is there, you maybe talk a little bit about the cultural impact that, some of those major sorts of changes like that might have.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you're creating a certain amount of disruption and uncertainty, which is something you have to pay attention to, I think, with your people. But the more you start getting everybody the same clarity and alignment that you need to have a successful finance transformation, you really start kind of creating one team out of it, even though there's multiple leaders. And you start saying, hey, we're trying to do these 5 things, right? We're trying to make things more timely and more accurate and more insightful. And you get everybody aligned with this overall objectives, and then they break that down for their individual process groups objectives.
Right. Yeah, makes total sense. We're here with Chris King talking about finance transformations versus digital transformations. We've got a lot more ground to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the ever-changing landscape of digital transformation? Then you need our newly released 2023 Digital Transformation Report. This comprehensive report covers the latest trends, technologies, and strategies to ensure your digital transformation is optimized for success. The 2023 Digital Transformation Report is packed full of proven methodologies and insights from experts in the independent digital transformation field. You'll also receive practical insights on how to implement digital transformation strategies within your unique organization. This free report is available for download on our website at thirdstage-consulting.com under our Thought Leadership section.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 98. I'm here with Chris King, and we're talking about finance transformations versus digital transformation. So let's jump back into the conversation. Here's a question I want to take from the audience here. Kyler on LinkedIn, and Kyler, by the way, is our podcast co-host. And she asked the question of what are some key indicators that an organization needs to evaluate for process effectiveness? So in other words, like in this example, you were just talking about the multinational finance transformation that you were leading. How did you know, or how did you measure that this process is broken and we need to focus on fixing it?
Yeah. What's interesting about that is where we started was we went up a level from the process to just the process group. And we said, let's organize the finance team according to these groups of processes. So groups like accounts payable or the purchase to pay process stream, right? All the people that support that are in the accounts payable process group, or collections or cash applications or general ledger accounting, et cetera. We organized by process group. And then the first thing we did was really try to get clarity among that group, getting them in the room of what is it the company needs you to do? Like, why does this group exist? What's your primary purpose and objective? So if you're talking about cash applications, right, the company needs us to apply the cash we get from our customers as quickly as possible, so the collections team isn't calling our customers about payments they've already made. And just getting sort of that clarity then says, well, what would it mean to get better? Well, we would get better at cash applications if we had fewer days from the day we'd received it to the day that it got applied, or we had less unapplied cash. And so you start getting those kind of metrics out of it as your kind of key indicators that you're going to improve. And then you start organizing yourselves around. So you've done your process improvement workshops, you've come up with some ideas for how you might make it better, but you start focusing on those of, well, what's going to most impact my number of days to apply my cash or my amount of unapplied cash. And then you get into some of the other kind of lean tools, like doing a root cause analysis of when we're not able to apply cash for a week, what is often the cause, and how do we fix that? How do we address some of those issues?
Right. So you're sort of doing that in parallel. You're measuring and analyzing and improving. You're sort of doing that in parallel as part of the initial analysis, but also as part of the improvements themselves.
Yeah, when you do that workshop, you come up with what I've kind of called, and I think it's a common lean term, IPOs, which stands for improvements, problems, and opportunities, which means I don't necessarily know how to solve it, but I found a problem I want to go act on. And so we would map these things out initially on a whiteboard with just sticky notes of step 1, step 2, step 3. And then we'd have a different color where somebody could say, hey, I see an IPO. I see something I think we can improve, right? I don't know what the problem is here, but I know it's not efficient. I've been doing it for a long time. And what really surprises you when you do this is how much the people who are responsible for the task understand how to make it better. But there's things in the organization that are actually preventing them from just making those improvements themselves. Get a number of obstacles in the way there.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think a lot of times people overlook their own internal resources, and the people on the front lines that are actually doing this stuff. A lot of times they have the answer, or they can come up with the answer. You don't necessarily need a super smart consultant or a super fancy technology to solve the problem for you. A lot of times it's a matter of facilitating and getting that knowledge out of the people that actually know how to do that stuff.
Yeah, and what I say is the most important thing to do when you start a finance transformation is to create an environment where positive change is easy. Most organizations don't start with that. They really don't. There's a number of obstacles that keep somebody who has an idea how to improve their own process from doing it. One of those obstacles is they can't see upstream or downstream. So the visibility that the person doing the work has can be limited as to what happens downstream. So with lean, they talk to you about the voice of the customer and really understanding what happens downstream, right? And then proactively going upstream and saying, hey, do you know you're causing me some problems with the thing that you're doing? But most organizations end up, fairly siloed there. And so if you can't tell what will happen if I push this domino and knock it over, right? And what other dominoes is going to hit and what impact is that going to have somebody else, then you need help from somebody above you. But what usually happens is you go to your manager and you say, hey, I'm thinking about making this change. I think you could make it better. Just wanted to check with you if you knew of anybody that might upset, right? And a lot of times the manager will say, you know what, just this really isn't my priority right now. Why don't you just keep doing it the way you've been doing it? And if you ask that question and get that answer a few times, you kind of stop asking the question altogether, right?
Right.
And then there's just a lack of those resources, where really what we're trying to achieve in a finance transformation is that we've created an environment where leaders are saying, how can I help you achieve your result? I know that you're trying to improve these metrics. I know you have some initiatives to do it. And when you have an obstacle you can't remove on your own, that is my role as your leader. I'm going to remove that obstacle for you. So come to me for it. That's a very different environment than most people find themselves working in if you're in one of these functions in finance.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes total sense. And then Grant from LinkedIn makes a comment that's sometimes more exciting than the other type of IPO we've heard of. So he seems like he prefers your type of IPO rather than the initial public offering, going public sort of IPO.
Right. That one makes some people rich. This makes us all a little richer.
It's well said. I want to come back in a second. I want to come back to some of the enablers of finance transformation, including technology, but not limited to technology. And we're also, by the way, we're going to get to a question here I have in a moment about your 10 principles of finance transformations. I want to ask you a question about that because you've developed sort of I don't know if it's your top 10 list, but it's your 10 principles for finance transformations. And I want to come back to that in a minute. But before we do that, I want to answer or ask this question about technology. And this is from Ryan over on LinkedIn. And he said, what role do emerging technologies like big data, blockchain, and artificial intelligence play in driving financial change and innovation? Now, I know you said technology is just an enabler. There's a lot of other stuff that you should do first before you start putting technology in place. But when you think about big data, blockchain, AI, et cetera, there's competencies that might enable more improvement that you might not otherwise get if you didn't have those technologies. So how did you see the role of emerging technology fit into your transformation, or were your improvements so fundamentally the improvements you wanted to make were so fundamental that you didn't really need to even think about AI and emerging technologies like that, or how do you find that right balance, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, that's I think it's a great question. I think that one of the things we did that I think was pretty effective was we really encouraged people to think about the art of the possible and go out and kind of educate themselves. You've been doing this role for a long time. You're running the accounts payable group or whatever. go out and spend a little time understanding what technologies are available, what other companies are doing in accounts payable, what solutions are out there, right, and what they bring, so that you have that perspective of just how it might help you. Um, I think some of these terms, blockchain and AI, are sexy, interesting terms. I think, how could that help me? The reality is, most companies have so much just fundamental work to do
Yeah.
to get to where they're making best use of their existing technology, and they've optimized their processes, that they really don't need to add that stuff to see a lot of improvement. However, once you've really identified exactly, like, you feel like, okay, I've optimized my use of existing technology the best I can. And I'm including, I've optimized my process, and I fixed the problems with my existing technology, and I've trained my team and they know how to use it well. And now I'm trying to get something extra out of my metrics, right? I understand what's most important for me to improve, what the company needs my team to do better. I'm trying to do it even better. I think there would be some ROI if I brought in some of these state of the art technologies, and was able to make use of them to help me do my process. And we did have, you know, Blackline uses AI technology. They're a kind of month-end close and reconciliation software solution and provider. And so, we had systems like that were bringing those latest things in. We did a lot, and I'll talk in a minute when we talk about the principles, maybe about around data and data improvement. But we didn't have to really tap into big data to get where we needed improvement from. It was just structuring the company's data that
Right.
was critical there. But
Yeah, it seems like a lot of organizations that we work with too, have, on one hand, you have sort of just the fundamental improvements that you talked about. Let's just get more efficient. Let's just stop doing the same thing a million different ways and do things, in a consistent way. And there's so much value right there that organizations can realize just from doing real basic blocking and tackling. So you've got organizations that have real basic fundamental improvement opportunities, and then you've got technology way over here. It's way ahead of where most organizations are. In fact, I would argue the technology is changing exponentially faster than organizations are changing. And that chasm between where we are today and where technology could take us is so great that a lot of times organizations they stumble and fall into a bunch of pitfalls along the way, or they try to overreach on, hey, let's bring in AI and big data and all this stuff, when we haven't really even figured out the basic fundamental stuff. Like, let's just be more efficient. Let's just be more profitable and consistent and all that good stuff. So is that something you've seen as well?
yeah, I think it really just comes down to getting to the point where you know exactly what problem you're trying to solve, and why
Yeah.
your existing technology is a limiting factor in your improvement, and you need something else. Thinking that, we're really out of date. We really haven't done any improvement in a long time. If we just had this shiny new toy, right, that's best and top of the line kind of software here, we could fix all our problems. And the idea that the system integrator and the team putting in software is going to fix any major problems is just unrealistic. They just don't have the time to stop and say, hey, let's get to the root cause of why you have bad data in your old systems, right? They can try to clean it up along the way, but if you haven't addressed some of those root causes of those issues, you're not going to have a successful implementation, or you're not going to solve those problems with your implementation. But it's just very tempting sometimes to think, let's start this process with a solution selection process, right? Let's start with an RFP, instead of really starting with helping each team get to where they are. And then they really have the ability to come to you with a good business case and say, hey,
Right.
here's what we've accomplished, and here's why we can't go any further with what we got, and here's a solution we found when we were exploring the art of the possible.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Now, what about you mentioned a moment ago, Blackline, sort of a very targeted type of software. It's not trying to be everything in a finance group. It's certainly not trying to be everything within an entire organization outside of finance. But it begs the question of, this is a question from Kyler on LinkedIn. How does this process work translate to new finance tech? What are your thoughts on full ERP systems versus best of breed in finance? So in other words, if we're trying to change our finance organization and drive a finance transformation, should we be looking at ERP technologies, or should we be looking at more specific point solutions? Does it just depend? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
I think it certainly depends on what problem you're trying to solve. You know, when I arrived at my last engagement, I was really expected that you're going to lead the implementation of a new ERP system. And by the way, we've already hired, you know, the project manager and the program manager, and they're working on an RFP and it's ready to go out. And I kind of put the brakes on that because I was trying to get into what are the problems that we have and what are the solutions going to be. And I found, you know, a new ERP wasn't going to do that for a number of reasons. And the number one was most of our people in the finance team weren't actually working in the general ledger system because they had a sort of industry specific ERP and then a separate that wasn't really good at general ledger stuff and a separate general ledger piece and different items. I think when you look at kind of full ERP and do I get as much of my solution as I can from a single provider, I think that reduces complexity potentially, and you know reduces the amount of integration points and the changes, and then you have, you know, the trade-off of best in breed on some stuff. I think that when you've done the work I'm talking about, you're much better able to make the decision about why the additional functionality of getting a best in breed solution in a particular area over using the one from the ERP provider is worth that extra effort of integration or coordination. Yeah. Right, you can really understand what data will we have less access to if we have these two pieces, or how much work will we have to do to get those two pieces working together.
And
I don't think there's a single right answer for any organization. I think, you know, kind of you always have to start where you stand, and you know you're always starting with some amount of already embedded technology, and you know I think that influences a lot how you go about it.
Yeah, and one of the caveats I'd add to what you said, or just the counterpoints that the industry will often throw at you as a potential software buyer, is if you're talking to ERP vendors about what you just said, about the whole best of breed concept and how maybe it's worth the integration, it's worth the headache of having to tie together multiple systems, that might be worth it if it's driving more business value. But ERP vendors will most likely tell you that's a terrible idea. Not because it is, but because it threatens their model. Right. Their job is to sell you one system that does everything within an organization. If you go best of breed, that is a challenge, or that's a threat to them. So you just have to be aware of that counter messaging that you'll get in the sales cycle in the industry.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've seen this too, but what I've seen also, sometimes these ERP vendors have acquired another solution in order to address this area of the market that they weren't serving before, and it doesn't integrate any better with their system than
totally. Yeah, I agree. That's a great point. I mean, you look at like SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, all those guys have gone out and acquired other solutions, and you're essentially buying a best of breed system. And the only difference is they want you to buy that best of breed system or solution from just them, not other third parties, but really just making sure you have a clear vision of what it is you need. And like you keep saying, Chris, you know, it depends on where the business value is and what you're trying to accomplish, and, you know, let the technology fall into place behind that first and foremost. What about these 10 principles of finance transformations that you have? And I know we probably don't have time to go through all 10 of them in great detail in the interest of time, but maybe you could cover some of the major threads or buckets that are covered in those 10 principles of finance transformations.
Yeah, thanks. So I started out by bucketing them into kind of these 5 areas of the target operating model. So I have 2 principles about people, and 2 about process, 2 about technology, 2 about information, or 2 about data, and 2 about information. And then breaking that, and it kind of worked out that way. I actually, you know, I had the opportunity in the last role to just experiment and try out some things. And honestly, I had 12 principles of finance transformation there, and they weren't so neatly structured, and I kind of arranged them this way. Right. But I like the order in that you're really starting with people, and that first principle is about investing in staff, and it really goes to the idea that the capability of a finance organization really can't be much more than the sum of the capabilities of the people in it. And if you can really start investing in their development and really being willing to say, this is going to be a place where you become more valuable in the marketplace. Right. I mean, that's kind of the deal, right? I want to create an environment where you feel like you're learning a lot, and someday you may leave my organization and take what you've learned and bring it somewhere else, and that's okay. But I want to create an environment where we're continually developing and learning, and we have a culture of doing that. Because now I have people that are curious, that are going out self-learning, that are thinking about ways in which they can make their area better. So
Hmm.
that's one of the key ones in people. The second one in people is one that you've talked about and provide services for, which is just change management, really embracing kind of formalized change management. I love the ADKAR model, and really looking at, if I'm going to transform finance, that means I'm turning it into something else. You don't use a term like transformation to describe a small change where
Right.
it's slightly different. It's like we're trying to make the organization something different than it was. So I really have to be thinking about change management. I'm trying to transform the organization by transforming all the people in it. And I need to know where everybody is kind of along that ADKAR model, and where I've lost people, right? If I've lost them back and I know not everybody's familiar with the ADKAR model, but first stage of that is awareness of a compelling reason for change. If I've lost somebody there, then I got to go back and get them from there. And I won't have succeeded in doing a finance transformation if I've left people behind. And
Right.
then on the process side, that's where I get into my kind of lean finance principles and this sort of organization around these process groups. So I create little teams around process groups, and each team is trying to make themselves better with some goals that align to the overall finance goals. So we kind of use this 3 to 5 year objectives, those 5 areas for improvement. But now I need to come up with annual areas of focus for the finance team. And then each little team needs to figure out what that means for them and what they're going to go out and focus on in kind of this sort of annual planning cycle.
Hmm.
And then when I get to technology, I break that down between optimal use of existing technology and implementing new technology. And it's when and how do we implement new technology, and this kind of concept of active sponsorship, which I kind of describe as the opposite of distancing yourself from a potential failure, which I think a lot of executives do sometimes. You put the onus on the system implementer and the people who are going to bring in new technology to make it successful. And as soon as things start going south, you see people, who are the executive sponsors of things, kind of creating a little bit of space between them and the project that's not going that well. I think that really what that active sponsorship means is that you're going in really mining for the potential problems that are going to happen, and plugging those up. But before you get the new technology, you really have to look at optimizing your use of existing technology. Most organizations have some top of the line technology that they are not getting top of the line output
Hmm.
out of. And you really have to also realize that for every technology out there, no matter how good it is, there are organizations that have put it in very well and are using it very well, and there are organizations that haven't. We were putting in a solution called High Radius Cloud Collections in that AR team. And one of the things I talked to the team about was, of all their customers, 25% of them are, would say they're in the top quartile of how well they're using it and how effective it is for them, right?
Hmm.
And 3/4 of the companies aren't, and the ones at the bottom aren't getting a lot of use, and they're thinking maybe I need a different solution, right?
Right. Right.
And there is more difference between the companies that implement high radius really well and those that don't than there is a difference between high radius and its competitors. And so you have to be pretty purposeful of, have I implemented my existing technology really well, or should I be changing it there? And we looked at Blackline, Concur, Excel, Power BI, and said these are all top of the line technology. I mean, Excel is the best spreadsheet solution out there, right? It's not the best EPM out there, right?
Right.
And some use it as that, but it is the best spreadsheet solution out there. And yet, although everybody on the finance team uses Excel, there is not a single person on the finance team that would be more efficient and more effective if they knew how to use it better than they do, right?
Hmm.
The skill levels among the people all vary, but wherever you are and however you got to where you are, you could improve it. And the barriers to improving your Excel skills are very low. You can go out and watch YouTube videos, right? You can read books, right? But you don't even have to spend money on a book. You certainly don't have to spend money on a course. It's available there for free. It just takes operating an environment where positive change is easy, right? Where I actually have the time to go out and self-learn. I'm not so Stephen Covey talked about sharpening the saw, right?
Right.
That's sharpening the saw stuff, right? If you're too busy cutting trees to sharpen the saw, right? You're too busy doing your Excel work to learn how to use it better. Then you're not even making effective use of it. So we really emphasize that principle a lot first, and then by the time you were talking about new technology, you'd really kind of addressed all these other areas. On the data side, I kind of focus on both structuring the data well and getting the right dimensions for the data, and thinking about the outcomes we want from it, and how we improve that data structure. And then data stewardship, and really getting people to understand, that data is an asset of the organization. I need to own it. I need to be a good steward of it. If I take a data set and I add bad data to it, I'm really impairing the value of it, right? And somebody needs to be responsible for where that's going. And then the information side is about just taking data and how do you make that useful and insightful. And I focus on two things there. One is driver-based forecasting, which could be a whole nother podcast, so I won't get into it. And the other is just better use of business intelligence tools and data visualization. And that's always kind of low-hanging fruit that really has an impact on the organization, right? Your stakeholders really see it when you start providing dashboards and self-serving or allowing self-service of the information you're providing.
We're here with Chris King talking about finance transformations versus digital transformations. We've got a lot more ground to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology-agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 98. I'm here with Chris King, and we're talking about finance transformations versus digital transformation. So let's jump back into the conversation. It seems like those 10 principles of finance transformation are focused on really getting value out of what you've got, organizationally, process-wise, technologically. Of course, there's also the technology piece and thread that could further enable the changes. But you made a really interesting point when you were talking about high radius, about how and maybe you could restate it, because I think it's a really, really good point. The part about how, would you say the bottom quartile versus the top quartile of high radius users, that delta is bigger than any improvement you might get from using
we spend a lot of time on sort of system selection, right, and comparing Remilia and high radius and which one can do what, and let me see a demo and let me look at pricing and everything. And yet the pricing of this solution was relatively low for the amount of value that we got, right? And we brought $20 million in. The cost of licensing of either one wasn't very big. Both solutions were similar. But the premise there was that if we can become one of the best companies at putting it in and using it, we will get far more value than if we kind of go along for the ride. We don't know where we're really trying to go.
Or if you go find a better solution, because let's just assume there's a better solution out there, incrementally better than high radius.
A better solution, unless you're really purposeful about making sure you're going to be in the top of the companies that chose it, then I don't think you're going to really realize that incremental benefit of one solution over another.
Yeah, it's a great point. And a great way to look at it too. And a lot of what you're saying too with those 10 principles is it almost feels like it's an enabling an organization to get a blueprint in place for what the future state is going to be. And when it does come time to go find and implement a new technology, you've got that blueprint laid out, and you're going to be more purposeful, as you'd say, about finding the right technology, deploying the right technology, not overspending on a bunch of shelfware and stuff that you're not going to use, and making sure you're implementing in a way that adds a lot more business value. So I like the way you've laid that out.
Yeah, I mean, over the course of this transformation, we gained a lot of confidence that if we were to put in, or wherever we put in, because we did put in new technology, but wherever we put it in, we would be, you know, um, really, we greatly improved our likelihood of being successful at putting that in and realizing it very well, because we were much clearer about what it was we were trying to improve, how it would impact the business, and what the problems were that we had. And one of the things we did there was we had an annual finance transformation summit. At the end of the year, we'd get people together. We had to do it virtually because during COVID. We actually did it in person the first time, back in 2019, I guess. Yeah. And the purpose of that was to kind of talk at a high level of the 3 to 5 year objectives for the organization, right? And then what is it in this calendar year? What is the finance organization really most focused on, and what's most important? And then working in those individual teams to come up with how they would connect their own goals to those goals, and how they would identify what's most important for them. And we had this principle that came from the 4 disciplines of execution. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a Franklin Covey book by Chris McChesney came out. It's really about how to execute on wildly important goals. But there was one piece of that that really stuck with me, which was this idea that people and teams could focus on achieving 1 to 3 goals at once, and achieve 1 to 3 goals with excellence. And if they tried to achieve 4 to 7 goals, they tended to achieve 1 or 2 with excellence. And if they tried to achieve more than 7, they tended to achieve 0. And so we really tried to keep people to say, hey, the initiatives coming out of your team at any one point in time should kind of be 1 to 3 of them. We're going to land one plane at a time. But then over the course of a year, you might have more than that, right? Because you don't have to do them all at once. So we do that planning at the end of the year. And then we had this 4-week cycle where every week we had a 45-minute meeting, and a quarter of the teams would report out for about 8 to 10 minutes in that meeting. So each team was reporting out every 4 weeks. The meeting was happening every week, and you heard from a fourth of the teams each week. And what they would report out on was their dashboard of those metrics. Here's what's most important for us to improve. We've got this dashboard showing the change in these metrics over time. So here's how our dashboard's going. We have 3 initiatives right now to act on these key metrics, right? And that we think will be impactful. And here's how they're going. And they'd give a little update on how the initiatives were going. I'd ask, how can I help, right? What obstacles are you finding? What barriers do we get out of the way? And it would be an opportunity for just collaboration and sharing and hearing from each other. It would be an opportunity for celebration of the results and the successes that they were having. It was an opportunity for feedback and suggestion, and an opportunity to ask for that help and support that they needed. And that's where I really feel like you've transformed, right? Everybody in the organization is part of a team that understands what it would mean to be better. Everybody's tracking the metrics that indicate they're better, and everybody has a plan and some initiatives for how they're going to act on it right now. And they've evolved to the point where we've gotten so much efficiency out of our day-to-day from the work we've already done that we're now able to spend 25, 40% of our time on these initiatives without hiring any additional people, right? It came from our existing team. Right. So it's not just existing technology, but it's existing team, existing technology. You really optimize all that first. Now, by the time you go to write a check for somebody to bring in something new, you really know exactly what it is you need to do, right? Because sometimes those 3 initiatives that we're going after, they'd say, we want to put in high radius, right? We've done the work. We think this is the next step that would be a game changer for us.
And it sounds like one of the maybe secondary but really important benefits of this whole philosophy and approach that you're talking about is that it also creates a sense of ownership within the organization. So in other words, you're not just going to go outsource this transformation to a bunch of consultants and technology vendors. You're actually owning it. You're the one defining what that blueprint looks like and what the business is going to be and how you're going to use technology, if you're going to use technology to drive any of that transformation. Whereas a lot of organizations that don't do the stuff that you just described, they end up being in sort of a helpless mode. That it's a learned helplessness where they need to bring in a system integrator or a consultant to come tell them how to do things because they don't know. But what you're advocating is taking ownership. Maybe that may not be the first and foremost intent of it, but it is driving a sense of ownership and accountability within the organization as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because people are saying, this is my mission. This is what we are working on as a team there. And you can outsource putting in new technology, right? You can hire system integrators and firms and go write that check for that software. What you cannot outsource is a change in your culture to becoming a high performance culture where everybody is interested in learning and improvement. You can't outsource the people development, the leadership of your team. And once you really get that, then you've really, one of the lean principles is empowerment, right? You've really empowered the whole organization to understand what would make things better. And now when you're putting in new technology, it's not something you've decided to do to the people, right? We are getting a new ERP and you are going to be trained on how to use it, and it's going to go live for you and change your world on this date, right? It's more about, hey, we're trying to improve our function and we've decided this new technology. Now, obviously there is coordination. You put it on the ERP, it's going to impact a lot of people. It's not an individual team saying that they need it, right? But you should be hearing then from multiple teams saying, hey, it's the ERP that's slowing us down.
Yeah, and I imagine there's a few executives listening right now that maybe are a little bit disappointed. Yeah, Skylar's comment here on LinkedIn is outsource leadership equals no leadership, which is a great point, very well stated. And I guess it sort of leads to another question here, which is, a lot of executives listening right now might be thinking of themselves like, oh, shoot, I was hoping that these guys were going to provide me the answer of how I could just outsource all this, because this all sounds like a pain in the rear and I don't want to deal with it. But what you're saying is you can't really do that. You have to roll up your sleeves and take ownership of that. But what, in general, when you're looking at a finance transformation, what should the CFO's role be in particular? Like that senior person within the finance organization, what does that look like? What should their expectations be of what they do and how they contribute and lead a transformation?
I mean, I think the first one is alignment of the leaders and managers. You have to make sure everybody's on the same page. I think that's often one of the challenges is kind of lack of alignment. HBR ran an article a few years ago, and they were talking about the top problems with digital transformation, actually. But the number one problem was an unspoken disagreement among management about goals, right? And I think that's a pervasive problem. If you're not explicit and you don't do a little work among the senior finance team to get good alignment, then you're going to end up with, a lot of people sort of pulling in different directions and a lot less progress. And so I think that has to be the role of the CFO, to get his team or her team together and say, what is our objective and why, both in terms of for the finance transformation and then just annually as part of an ongoing cycle. Clarity of objectives, and just whether it's my 5 areas and how you get better, or something else, or why you're choosing 2 of those over the rest of them or whatever. But you have to create clarity, and as Patrick Lencioni says, you have to over communicate organizational clarity, right? You don't create clarity by saying it once or putting it on a slide in a slide deck at one point. So I think that's an ongoing role of the CFO, to be over communicating that clarity, really empowering the entire team. And people will not feel empowered unless they really hear repeatedly from the leader that it is their job to improve their job. In fact, one of the obstacles I hear about people, why haven't you changed this before? You see the problem, right? We just mapped it. You came up with the IPO. You see how it could be better. And it's like, my job isn't to change it. My job's not to improve it. It's to do it. The CFO has to allow everybody the room to do that. And part of that is creating an environment where you can make some mistakes. And part of it's, creating an environment where positive change is easy. I think mining for obstacles where support is needed. You have to sometimes ask the question. I see what you're trying to do here, right? In our sort of weekly check-in meetings, I'd say, I see that you're trying to improve this and you're having some issues with upstream departments, for example. How can I help? Bring me to that meeting. And then really important for the CFO, I think, is being an ambassador for the executive team, the board, other stakeholders, people that might be impacted by a little bit of disruption, right? If I go out there and put in a new accounts receivable system like HighRadius, it's going to automatically send emails to customers. Then there's a host of sort of salespeople and customer relationship owners that need to know about that, need to understand why it's important. And I think the CFO can play a big role there. I had this luxury of being dedicated to sort of finance transformation. The CFO could worry about the board, the CEO, the executive team, all that. I could worry about the internal organization. That's not always possible. And CFOs aren't always able to spend the time and really get into the detail. But I think that if you can't, then you either need somebody you trust who can do that, and you need to provide those whatever 5 things I said, or you can get even more involved. And if your answer is, look, I'm just too busy for this. Who can I write a check to and do stuff? I would actually start with that problem. Like, how do you get yourself to where you can spend more time leading your organization well and less time dealing with the CEO's latest fire alarm?
Yeah, and maybe you rethink what the scope and what the definition of the transformation for your organization is, because it may be that taking on a massive, widespread transformation is not realistic. Maybe you don't have the capacity or the internal focus at the moment to deal with that. So you sort of scale back expectations, which isn't the end of the world. I mean, you could do an incremental transformation, even though, to your point, the word transformation suggests that it's a massive jump, but maybe it's not such a massive.
One of these process groups, you could do a transformation of that process group with the right, leader helping them. Now,
so just sort of bring this all full circle and maybe summarize here as we come up at the end of our time here. For those that are about to embark on or already in the midst of a finance transformation, and I suppose just a lot of what you're talking about, by the way, that we've been talking about throughout this conversation is we've been focused on finance transformation, but a lot of this is relevant to any sort of digital transformation as well. But what sorts of advice, what are the 2 to 3 things you would leave organizations and team members with for how they should get started? What are the 2 or 3 most important things to keep in mind as you embark on a finance or digital transformation?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes have said start where you stand, right? I said it earlier. You gotta understand kind of where you are and just start moving forward from there. But I really like the Dr. Covey principle of begin with the end in mind. So try to understand where it is you're trying to get to, which is really sustained improvement, right? I'm really trying to create an organization that's just always able to get itself better. I would really think about that. Am I creating an environment where positive change is easy, or is our culture, are our systems, is our hierarchy, is something actually interfering with that? And you won't find that out without really getting in and talking to some of the people about their issues and what's kept them from changing it before. And then really just empowerment. I mean, you want to make a lot of progress, get a lot of people doing the work, right? And if you have good alignment and good clarity, then you can involve a lot of people in it.
Right. Yeah, it's great sound advice. And just a kind of a closing comment here from Peter on LinkedIn. He said, if only more CFOs thought like this guy. So thanks for thinking like this, Chris. And this guy, by the way, is Chris King. He's the founder of Transformative CFO. Tell us about the website. What's the address that people can find you or how can people connect with you and learn more about you?
The website is transformativecfo.com. I've got the 10 principles of finance transformation there and some other articles, some information about lean finance. I'm going to be producing more there, and now I'm just starting this consulting practice to kind of be the guide on the side for CFOs and finance teams that want to go through this, and kind of train the trainer and help bring some of these things forward. And look forward to continue doing with that, and be happy to hear from anybody who's looking to get in this fight.
Well, thank you, Chris. Thanks for being here. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. Those were really well stated questions and some good feedback there. So really appreciate all the feedback. And we're going to unpack the conversation a bit more with Kyler and I here in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 98. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham, and you can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as audio podcast platforms throughout the world. Be sure to check us out on social media as well. All the major social media platforms, we're posting videos, graphics, blogs, all kinds of stuff related to digital transformation on a daily basis. So be sure to follow us on social media if you don't already. So we just had Chris King on the show talking about finance transformations. What were some of your takeaways from that conversation, Kyler?
Yeah, well, it was obviously a great conversation. It was funny. I was thinking the entire time, like, what a refreshing perspective for a CFO to have, because we have a lot of content around how challenging it can be to not only be a CFO, but be involved in a transformation as a CFO, because you're not only responsible for the overall operations of a very complex part of the organization, but you're also responsible for how much you spend on the actual transformation project. And so I was sitting there thinking, wow, what a refreshing perspective to hear. And some of our audience were commenting on, I wish all CEOs were like Chris, or CFOs were like Chris, and thought about that in such an innovative way. So I think that's, we talk a lot about the evolving CIO, but there might be something along the same thread there for an evolving CFO when it comes to a more technology integrated organization.
Yeah, that's a great point. I actually didn't think that, or I'd think of that when he was chatting or when we were getting that feedback from the audience during the interview. But you're right. He does think differently than a lot of CFOs. A lot of CFOs are in my opinion, at the risk of stereotyping and overgeneralizing. A lot of times CFOs are very black and white. They don't see the gray, and see the arts and the importance of the arts of transformation in the way that Chris does. And obviously, dollars and cents are important. The black and white stuff is important, especially when you start talking about ROI and total cost of ownership and business value and all that stuff. That's all really important. But to get there, to get that end result, you have to know kind of the nuances and the art behind it. And I think that's something that he did a good job explaining. In particular, the fact that it's some of these intangible organizational and operational things that really need to lead the transformation, and then technology sort of follows behind that. And that's opposite. That's entirely counter to the way a lot of CFOs think. They want to lead with technology, go all in on a new technology platform, and assume that that's going to drive the changes for them, rather than the way Chris was talking about it. So I think it's a great point.
Absolutely. And I love the way that Chris positions that, as you have to get the fundamentals before you go out and get the technology. And many times, again, in a dollars and cents role, it's pretty simple. The technology comes in, it gives you an ROI, and you should see that in X amount of time. But understanding the holistic background around setting that up for success, almost staging it, and getting your operations efficient, looking at your processes to lean them out, to optimize them, are really that phase zero that we preach so hard to our clients. Just because it's very easy to get excited about new technology, but we talked kind of last week with Ghassan about garbage in, garbage out, right? You could have the best technology in your, your accounting department, but if you still have manual processes, broken processes, inefficient processes, that technology is not going to be able to enhance or bandage any of those broken approaches. So I think it's so important that he says that. And then also the maintenance that goes around that. It's not just a one-time audit of the overall organizational processes. It's a journey, a health check, if you will, annually or wherever it makes sense for your organization to really look at that, and its ongoing behavior within the organization, which I think is so healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. He talked about that digital culture and just changing the culture of the organization. And I think that's another one of those gray area, uh, intangible or soft sides of change and transformation that a lot of CFOs miss. They miss that really important nuance.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear, from the finance side, because I feel like every organization I've worked in, with the exception of our amazing CFO at Third Stage here,
Right.
but
She's amazing.
I know, right? I'm terrified of the accounting department, because you go up there and they're one of those departments, just like IT had been traditionally, of you do it X, Y, and Z, and that's how we do it, and that's how we've always done it. So I can only imagine trying to go in to a group as a consultant, build that trust, understand those processes, and showcase and change that perception that you're actually going to enhance those. That to me is a terrifying concept.
Yeah, I
So I
agree.
can't
Yeah.
I can't imagine doing that so gracefully, like you and Chris had kind of laid out how that looks, not only in addressing resistance but also addressing value in automation. We see automation come in specifically in the finance world, and still making sure you understand the roles and responsibilities of the people that work there, not just the technology.
Yeah. Yeah. And really designing and architecting what the operations, the technology, the people, roles and responsibilities, the org design, all that stuff is super important, especially if you're trying to drive big efficiency gains like you talked about, especially if you're trying to drive strategic value. I mean, that's all stuff that comes from redefining your future state operating model as well as the organization and the technology behind it as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think we should do a follow up to that. And because it seemed like we were kind of evolving the conversation into change management when we run out of time, which we always do.
Right.
But I would be so interested to hear, specifically in finance organizations, the challenges or the tactics around change management. Because we always, we have a running joke of, Bob in accounting with his spreadsheet. But the reason we have that running joke is because that's something we see all the time.
Right.
so,
Right.
so I'd love to hear that as a follow-up conversation with Chris, because it was such great insights in how you really create those fundamentals and those foundations to be successful. And that's so important, because many times that's overlooked. Especially in fintech, when we talk about all types of emerging technologies. I love his approach of like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Those are all cool. They're super great. But until you actually figure out how to have a healthy operating financial system, then there's no point in looking at those any other technologies.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's well said. I'd love to hear in the comments too from the audience here of all those threads that Chris talked about. Is when you talked about operating model, um, the organization, the data, the technology, the information. He kind of talked through those major threads that he thought were so important in any sort of finance transformation or digital transformation in general. I'm curious to see what you think, which ones you think are the most important or which one you found to be the most effective. Or if you have anything to add to his list, I'd be curious to hear that in the discussion or in the chat here on this podcast. So love to hear your feedback there. Well, good. It was great to have Chris on the show. He was a first time guest, and again, the first ever client of Third Stage. So I didn't mention that to him in person as we were talking there, but it's certainly worth noting here that he was our very first client. So it's good to have him on the show for a number of reasons. So good. We're going to shift gears here and bring on our next guest, which is actually a replay of an interview we did earlier this year here in 2022. It's Kyler. It's your third of your top three interviews of 2022. Now, do you have a ranking? Is this number 1, 2, or 3, or is it just one of 3?
Oh man, I feel like you've really cultured me into the it depends. So I
Yeah.
cannot answer that question. I cannot. But these were my 3 favorite, and I think 3 most relevant when it comes to kind of what we look at. And the reason I picked it is we have the people side. When we talked with Tim last week, And then we had really the metrics and analytics side to people management. And now you have more of the logistics side and understanding what that looks like. And I especially think that's important now as we go into a very timely holiday season, and understanding the logistics behind what it takes to actually ship and supply these products as well to Santa's workshop, obviously. So
Yes, absolutely. For all the kids listening here today, without supply chain management, Santa would not be able to bring you toys.
mhm.
Although I suppose if all the toys are made at Santa's workshop, I guess, is there a need for supply chain management? Isn't Santa the supply chain? I don't know. I guess
You
I might
sound
be
like my 2-year-old and 3-year-old. Like, I don't have all the answers, guys.
I tend to
Let's
think
just.
like a 2 and 3-year-old. I ask similar questions that a 2 or 3-year-old would. So, um, no, but I'm probably overthinking that. But so either way, what you're saying is we've had about 50 episodes this year,
Mhm.
um, and more than that in terms of interviews. But even if this interview's in the top 3, it's easily in the top 5%. Let's just say in your opinion, of interviews. And this is Blythe Brumleve talking about the future of supply chain management and logistics. We'll also get into seasonality and how to manage to seasonality, which is very timely this time of year. So we'll play you that clip when we come back. But first, we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
Give me the sense to wonder.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 98. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday, so be sure to check us out on a weekly basis. I'm here with Kyler, and Kyler, this is your third of your top 3 favorite interviews of 2022 so far. So we thought we'd roll the clip, and then when we come back from the clip, we'll talk just a little bit about why you like it so much and what some of the takeaways are from that. So let's roll the clip here. This is Blythe Brumleve on the show a few months ago talking about the future of supply chain management and logistics. Blythe, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And you pronounced all of that correctly, which is very rare for people who interview me. I know my name is challenging.
I usually mispronounce names all the time, so I'm just glad I dodged that bullet here today. Well, thank you for being here. It's great to have you on the show. This is the first time you and I have chatted in a podcast format like this. A really excited perspective and get your perspective on supply chain and logistics, which is something that you touch on a daily basis. But before I get into my questions and any questions from the audience, maybe just tell us a little bit about your background, sort of how you came up in this space, and also what Digital Dispatch does.
Sure. So my name is Blythe Brumleve. I have been working in logistics and supply chain for a little more than 12 years, or about 12 years now. I got started as an executive assistant working at a 3PL, an asset-based 3PL in Jacksonville, Florida, here in the States. And at the same day that I started that job, I also started a sports and entertainment blog. So I was a former waitress that kind of got recruited to go into the logistics field, knowing that I wouldn't have to sit at a desk all day. And so my biggest thing is I didn't want to sit at a desk all day. And here I am sitting at a desk all day. But my boss was a former truck driver who worked his way up in that company and bought out the rest of the ownership, became the sole owner of that company. And when he found out about my little side hustle with a sports and entertainment blog, he said, well, why don't you start doing that for us? And so I was handed the keys of the website development, design, and marketing initiatives for, $140 million logistics company. And I had really no idea what I was doing. This was really early on in the social media days. Twitter had just launched. I believe Instagram had just launched or was right around the corner from launching. We were also very new or very early adopters to the HubSpot methodology of inbound marketing, which I was really passionate about. I've never been big on like, cold calling or cold emailing. Those always felt like, sort of the easy ways to get leads and to get, qualified business. And so during our HubSpot initiative, that's when we were the second logistics company ever on the HubSpot platform. So this is like
Hmm.
2009, 2010, very early on in those days. So I worked for that company for about 5 years. Unfortunately, considering an asset-based company, that was also during the Great Recession. So during the recession, during the downturn, unfortunately, that company ended up closing down after 5 years, which was super heartbreaking. And then so that sort of put me in a position to almost be like at a fork in a road and either choose to stay in this industry or to expand out. I chose to expand out. I went to media side of things. So I worked for a magazine, worked for a radio station, local TV, did all of those things mainly in the sports and entertainment sector. So then I went back after a few years because frankly, sports and entertainment, money just isn't really there unless you make it super big. So I didn't really see it as a long-term career trajectory for me. So then that led me to go back into freight. That's kind of the funny thing about working in, logistics and the freight world is that it always finds a way to sort of pull you back in. So I went back to work in freight and quickly realized that I needed to launch my own agency, that, I needed to be able to call the shots and, make the decisions on where I think we needed to invest according to the attention economy. And so that evolved into starting a different podcast, starting, video networking, not video networking or video creation that leads to digital networking. And then now I do it full time for myself, for the business over at Digital Dispatch. So I help other freight companies build a better website. And then on the other end, I also now host a show called Cyberly for Freight Waves that appears every Thursday at 2 p.m. So I kind of get to blend both of those worlds and get to talk to, cool people like you and, meet all the rad people in the chat. And really, I think that's the beauty of the industry that we work in is that, we're connecting the components of the components all throughout the world. And it's a new story every day. It's a new challenge every day. That's why I love this industry.
Yeah, yeah, it's very cool. It's a cool background too because it's not just a traditional supply chain and logistics background. That sports and entertainment piece that makes it interesting too. I imagine that somehow influences or informs the way you do your podcast and the other sorts of marketing type of stuff you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, I think for a long time, B2B marketing has been incredibly boring.
Mhm.
And when you really get into the niches of this industry, it's anything but boring. But that's all you see on the marketing side of things until, just recently, until, within the last couple of years, you're starting to see a brighter light being shined on the real work that we do, whether it's from, sourcing or procuring, different components or, trying to connect with a port over in Singapore. Like all of these things are just so cool. And now, we're just scratching the surface of highlighting those cool things that go on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I've got a ton of questions for you. You sort of touched on a lot of questions I'm going to ask you just in that little intro, though. So I appreciate that. That's super interesting. But before I sort of dive into these questions, I wanted to just turn to the audience really quickly and just look at where people are joining from today on the different platforms on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We have Jerry from Dallas, Brent from Calgary, someone from Atlanta, Oman, Colorado, Paris, France, India, greetings from New Jersey, California, Italy, and just all over the place. Saudi Arabia and North Carolina and
That's
India.
awesome.
By India. Yeah, so we're touching a pretty global audience here today. So thank you everyone for joining, especially those of you joining at strange times of the day for you or late in the evening. I appreciate you being here today. Um, so I guess just to start, I thought this would be a great sort of 20,000 foot flyover starting point for us, and then we can sort of dive into your background and your experience with supply chain and logistics in a little bit more detail. But if we just sort of back up and look at what is logistics? I mean, just help us understand. Maybe we kind of know what it is, or we've heard the term, but just maybe help us understand what is logistics and how does it fit into supply chain management in general.
Sure. So supply chain is essentially bringing all of the components that you need together to build a product, build a solution, and then ship those items from port to porch. I heard that phrase recently and I just love it, from port to porch. So the supply chain is that greater initiative of bringing all of those components together, the component of the component. But then logistics is the transportation management. So whether it's land, sea, air, also the storage of those goods, so warehousing, that logistics is really the transport of those goods to get them where they need to be. It may be, you need to get them to the business, or you need to get them to the consumer, but the logistics is the transfer of those goods from point A to point B.
Gotcha. Okay. So so supply chain is everything really, from getting raw materials to the manufacturing, warehousing. The port to porch part of it is within that, and then so we're kind of focusing within the logistics space in that port to porch space. And I hadn't
Yeah,
heard that either. Great,
well,
great
yeah,
term.
it's such a great phrase that I was like, oh gosh, I hope that, I went and looked and to see if that website was actually taken, and it is. So unfortunately, I could not claim it.
Oh,
So
yeah.
shout out to the person who did create it. But I think, for a lot of folks, they just see the goods around them, and they never really paid attention to how they actually got to where they're at. And if you look around your room, which is something that, maritime is a perfect example of this, where maritime shipping, 90% of all of your goods, if you look around the room right now that you're in, 90% of those goods were shipped on a cargo ship. And so for us to think about the complexities of how to get your product into a storage facility, and then from that storage facility to a container, and then that container onto a ship, and then the ship to, another side of the globe, and then to unload it and to transport it to another storage facility, and then that storage facility gets transferred to another distribution facility. It's an incredible amount of work and software that is all involved in this process. But at the end of the day, it's still a lot of these transportation, solutions that we have been using for hundreds of years, whether it's, transporting these goods by a ship or by a boat, or even some of the river systems, that canvas throughout the entire world. It's just so much going on that comes together in order to get the stuff that we need to, buy off Amazon or to buy off of another provider and get it shipped to us in 2 days. There's a lot of things that go on during that process.
Yeah, and things certainly have not gotten any easier with the pandemic and the disruptions and bottlenecks to supply chains that happened as a result. What are some of the ways that the logistics space has evolved in recent years, either just strategically and or in response to some of the impacts of COVID and the related supply chain impacts?
So I think of this in two ways. I think from the technology aspect, that's a huge one. For the majority of the time that this industry has been operating, it's been, sheets that we manually fill out. It's a bill of lading that someone physically prints out, someone physically signs, and then that bill of lading goes from one part of the world to the other. That part of the process has not changed, but the technology that's come into the space, and I think the data sharing that's gone on, is incredible to see. And we're really only, I mentioned, earlier, we're only kind of scratching the surface on, on the content side of things, but on the technology side of things, especially from data sharing, I think that we are really only scratching the surface. Being able to, save, 0.5% on the cost of shipment for your goods is an incredible savings, and technology can give you that. And when you're talking about, maybe like a percentage point or even a half a percentage point of savings, think about a giant cargo ship. If they have making, maybe $2.7 billion in revenue for the year, that 0.5% is a lot of money that you can save just simply by adopting new technology, data sharing between different companies, allowing, third-party vendors to, have access to that data. I think is another advancement that I really never thought that would come to fruition. I still think a lot of companies are scared to share their data because it is, proprietary to their company. But on the flip side, the amount of benefits that you can get simply by data sharing, I think, is incredible. And we're only really scratching the surface. Another big area that I think has changed is that the ability to network in a digital environment first. When COVID hit, that was because if you think about it, a lot of our connections that we made were made, going to trade shows, going to events, going to conferences. And when COVID happened, that just dried up instantly. And so we were forced to change our networking habits from the things that we were used to an entirely new environment. So you've seen the growth, and you can see, all the people in the chat right now that are coming in from LinkedIn. LinkedIn is one in particular that just exploded as far as, network conversations that you can have. You can have a digital handshake with somebody from across the world and then be able to eventually meet them at a conference, later on, obviously, when things, sort of settle down from, the COVID experience. But nowadays it's really quite remarkable to see that, Apple and Spotify, they don't even technically have a supply chain category in like their podcast, or even like a subcategory under business. But we still feel like is so much content that's coming out of these platforms. I saw a list the other day that now there are top 75 influencers in supply chain list. There's a top 60, a supply chain podcast list. These things did not exist 2 years ago. And a lot of those podcasts, honestly, are not very active anymore. But the amount of activity that we've seen since then has been just a dramatic increase. The knowledge base of sharing of information is so crucial to this industry. We talked about, data connections and data sharing, but also the information and the knowledge base and the experience sharing that's happening on social media, I think is another it's something that the industry has needed for quite a long time. And I'm glad to see it coming to fruition.
Yeah. Yeah. It is interesting how, once you start hearing politicians and mainstream media start talking about supply chain management, that's when it's sort of it's a fairly big deal. And I remember right when the pandemic hit, and just hearing politicians and people on TV talk about supply chains, I'm like, wow, I've never heard. You never hear anyone talk about supply
Right.
It was almost weird. So it's good that it's become front and center, and then more recently it's become front and center in a um, in a less positive way, I guess you'd say, in terms of people concerned about the supply chain, and rightfully so. What do you think? How do you think organizations are going to adjust to this new reality, or whatever you want to call it? Even though I hate that term, the new reality. How are organizations going to respond? How do you think they'll evolve their supply chains and their logistics function within that to sort of adjust to this new world we're in?
So I would say that for a lot of folks, adjusting to the communication aspect has been very challenging for them. These are folks who have never been used to being on camera, not used to doing something like this, where we're going on live and we're talking about industry issues and how can we solve these complex problems. So I think that for a lot of organizations, becoming comfortable with being on camera, executives becoming comfortable talking about, not just what's going on in their company, but the news that they may see out in the world. Maybe it's on FreightWaves, maybe it's on, some other, inbound logistics, some of these other, supply chain focused media companies. Maybe they see something there and they don't agree with it. Being comfortable sharing their opinions, not just in a boardroom, but in an online environment. I think that is still, if you are an executive in this space right now and you're not doing that, you are missing out on a gold mine opportunity, because that is the quickest way and the most efficient way to have, these digital platforms work for you and sell for you and market for you 24/7. We can't, that as I think for a lot of folks, we can't, we're doing this live stream for about an hour today. But afterwards, what happens with this live stream? You're going to take it, you're going to put it on a podcast. You maybe will take it and use social media clips to put out to your social media network. That kind of content works for you 24/7. And so I think for a lot of companies, adapting to that evolving business model, learning the technology that you have to use, not just to keep your business running, but also to keep the messaging running, I think is going to be one of the bigger challenges that a lot of companies are still just very challenged by. They don't see the investment in it quite yet, but the ones that have over the last couple of years, they are reaping the rewards, because the recruiting is getting easier, retention is getting easier, the ability to communicate with their team. They're probably, for a lot of companies, they might not be full-time back into the office yet, but it's an ability to, enhance those digital communications and supplement that communication until you're able to meet in person. I think too, we mentioned as far earlier with as far as like the adoption of, new technology. And with adoption of new technology, I think that's another thing that's a big challenge for a lot of companies is that they see a lot of, they're sort of I guess, guilty of falling for like the shiny object syndrome, where they see like a shiny new piece of software, but they have no idea how the in the trenches employees are using software and getting the job done today. So I think that, it's great that we have all of this technology coming into the space, but how are you using that technology to make the end user, or not really the end customer, of course, is going to benefit from it, but the end user who is actually using it on a day-to-day basis, I think there's definitely some room for improvement that needs to be made there. And, to try to avoid that shiny object syndrome where you're just going to buy a piece of software and think it solves all of your problems when, in a variety of different industries and aspects, that's just, it's not the right way to look at it.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting to hear your marketing slant, and I know that's your focus is marketing, but marketing within logistics. To your point earlier, having that kind of focus and that sort of a spotlight on the marketing opportunities for logistics companies. That's just something that hasn't been that common in the space because, like you said, B2B marketing has traditionally been pretty stale. When you compare it to B2C and what some of the big consumer product companies do. So that's pretty interesting. Okay, we're here playing a clip of Blythe Brumleve chatting with me about the future of supply chain and logistics. We're going to continue the conversation, but first we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
Interested in working for a company that truly values your unique skills and experience? Here at Third Stage, we don't hire based on resumes alone. We look at the full candidate, experience, and willingness to provide excellent service for our clients. Within a technology, independent, and agnostic consulting firm, you have the opportunity to learn across industries with a diverse group of clients. Our consultants also have the opportunity to diversify their portfolio and learn across technology systems. If you're interested in joining a high-growth entrepreneurial organization, please reach out to us at work@thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 98. My name is Eric Kimberling, and we're here with Blythe Brumleve talking about the future of supply chain management and logistics. One question I wanted to ask you that is actually not my question, so I will not take credit for it, but it's a really good one. It's from Sam Graham. Welcome back to the show, Sam. He's a regular, frequent contributor to our show from Spain, and he says, will reshoring lead customers to expect shorter delivery times, and will that lead to new logistics challenges? So maybe just explain what reshoring is, first of all. Second of all, is that trend towards more reshoring and maybe even bigger picture? It's not. It's also the sort of nationalism that seems to be spreading throughout much of the world that I imagine is probably impacting the supply chain as well. But how do you see that whole reshoring? What is that reshoring concept, and how do you see it impacting logistics and supply chain?
So for reshoring, particularly when it comes to the US, because with the US, we've spent years, offloading our manufacturing process to other countries. And when you have a situation like that, you realize how quickly it can become a national emergency. I'll use Puerto Rico as an example, because Puerto Rico, I think, manufactures 90% of the world's IV bags. And when they were hit by a hurricane, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was Hurricane Maria. When they were hit by Hurricane Maria, all of the world's IV bags were supply chain was it just collapsed within a matter of days. And so I think what you're seeing is not only reshoring and bringing the manufacturing closer to the US, but also the distribution of it. The idea that you can have the world's largest supply, 90% of IV bags being manufactured in Puerto Rico. The world needs access to those. And so I think that you don't even realize it until an emergency has happened. And so when you have an emergency come up like that, and also, obviously with what we've experienced with COVID, now there is that financial incentive. I think for a lot of businesses, they see a situation like what happened in Puerto Rico and they say, well, that's only going to happen, once every handful of years. That's not something that we really need to be, worried about over the long term, or we need to make these massive investments to bring reshoring back over to, say, the United States, or even, in Mexico, which is a big winner post COVID. That's where I think a lot of the opportunities are now being made, is that you're realizing a lot of these business owners, they're being given, the government realizes it first of all. So they're giving incentives to these companies in order to bring reshoring back to where it makes the most sense, where you can reduce those lead times, where semiconductors is one of the perfect ones right now. There's, having the world supply of semiconductor chips being made in Taiwan has worked well for a very long time, but all it takes is one global incident and that is shut off. You can't use your phones. You can't buy new phones. You can't buy new computers. Cars are sitting off in the lot, not being able to be driven off the lot because they don't have, this one component of a component. And so that's where I think a lot of these businesses are now, they're realizing the national security issue that arises from not having multiple distribution or multiple manufacturing spots, multiple distribution spots, and being able to diversify. If you were going to war, you wouldn't have all of your warships in one port. You would diversify them, because you learned after Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, we had the majority of our, naval and air fleet all located in one area, and all it took was one strike and you're wiped out. So I think that you're starting to see a lot of these businesses. I think it started with the government being able to offer these incentives to these business owners to bring some of that business back to the States. So now you're seeing semiconductor chips or manufacturing plants going up, I think in Texas and Ohio, here in the States. You're seeing more manufacturing return to Mexico and being built up in Mexico rather than, China and Vietnam. So it's a really fascinating sort of evolution of what it took to get the government to realize these issues, to create the incentives to make these businesses move their operations back, because they were making plenty of money in these other countries. What's the incentive to bring them back? So you have to, it's these complex solutions to these complex problems. And thankfully, the government has started to recognize that and given these other companies the incentives to capitalize on capitalism, I guess is probably the right word.
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting, and I didn't realize that about Pearl Harbor. So I got a little bit of a history lesson in there too. I didn't realize that was a problem logistically with having all the fleet in one spot like that. And it is a good analogy or a good comparison to what you have to think about with supply chain too. And I think too, I know one of the laws that the United States just recently passed, the U.S. government, I believe, was partially to invest in chip manufacturing in the U.S., knowing that we're too dependent potentially on other countries and there were shortages. And so it is interesting to see the government get more involved, not just in talking about supply chain management now, but now taking a more active role, for better or for worse, taking a more active role in sort of making sure that we're making these investments in supply chains and really diversifying, which is super interesting. One of the other things you mentioned, I think, was a really important one. You talk about how we spent years and years building this global supply chain. And it's really started in the 80s, maybe, or 80s and 90s. It seems like is where it really started. The pendulum started to shift toward that whole global supply chain aspect with big companies like Walmart. I know, being a big retailer, they sort of perfected supply chain management back in the 90s, and other organizations followed suit. So it's interesting that it's a really interesting point you make, that you have, say, 30 years of this global supply chain that was built, and in a blink of an eye, it's totally disrupted, and you're sort of rethinking that whole thing and trying to adjust. Do you think companies are just, how would you assess companies in their success so far in adjusting to what they need to be doing to be more effective in that environment?
So I think one of the cooler stories that we saw coming out of the pandemic is, I mean, it's not really cool that a lot of these cargo ships are, waiting, they're at berth off of, say, the Port of LA, for example. I think that they have, at the peak, they had somewhere like close to 70 ships that were off the port of off the West Coast ports, which is the Port of LA, Oakland, and then Long Beach. And so you had these situations where the waiting time was anywhere from 24 days to up to 60 days in order to unload a cargo ship. And when you think about that process of unloading, even when you arrive at port, then you have to take about anywhere from 4 to 5 days in order to offload that cargo ship. And whereas, compared to the rest of the world, I think they can get it done. I think China can get it done in a day at the port of Shanghai. There are other automated ports all across the or not the United States, but across the world that have, port automation. And so they can unload a cargo ship within a couple of days. But the US is still largely behind when it comes to the automation aspect of ports all across, whether it's the East Coast or the West Coast. And so what happens is during COVID, you saw some of these shippers. Home Depot, I think, was one of the first ones. They really just bought their own cargo ship because they couldn't find any space on all of the cargo ships that were leaving China. So they bought their own ship, and they put their own products on it, and then they transported all the way around, sometimes to the East Coast, in order to offload that cargo. Another interesting one was Amazon. They bought their own cargo ships as well, and instead of trying to wait it out on the West Coast, they just rerouted all of their ships that they just purchased and rerouted them over into the Gulf of Mexico. And I just think that is incredibly fascinating to think about it. Not just because manufacturing, of course, is going to it's happening right now. Those chess pieces are being set up both in the United States and in Mexico and in South America as well. But those take years to build those facilities. What in the more immediate near future, and what's really already happened, is that these ships are tired of waiting for the space on the cargo ship, because it's really come to find out, it's really who in order to, or what kind of price you're willing to pay in order to get onto one of these cargo ships. I heard, I think it's Nathan Strang from Flexport. He said the other day that a lot of these cargo ships operate like a Disney World or a Disneyland, where you have, your certain access points where you pay your admission fee and you can get on whenever you can get on the ride whenever you want to get on the ride. But then you can pay a little extra and get a fast pass, or you can do a single rider line. So it's kind of an interesting comparison to think about how all of these major US retailers were just struggling with not only finding containers, finding pallets, finding cargo ships, and how they've really adopted their own internal transportation methods in order to optimize their own transportation process. Because I think it's somewhere up like 45% of a company's revenue is all just a company's costs of doing business is all related to transportation costs. So if you can control it, you can get it down. You can get your shipments where they need to go, which is probably more important right now, is making sure that you can actually get the product and get it where it needs to go. That's where we're seeing a lot of retailers focus. And I think that, the purchasing of your own ship was one of the more fascinating things to come out of COVID.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. And that whole vertical integration, for lack of a better word, it seems like a lot of organizations are sort of bringing a lot of their supply chain functions in-house. And that's another part of the pendulum swinging or kind of going the opposite direction now compared to the past, where in the past it was all about outsourcing and finding the best 3PL provider and other third-party providers that can help with your supply chain. But now it seems like the pendulum's sort of swinging back to where, we need to control it. We want to invest in our own supply chain capabilities, which I find super interesting. We have a client actually that has, you might find this interesting, that we have a manufacturing client that was having so much trouble finding pallets to ship their product that they went out and bought a pallet manufacturer. And it was that important to them, and it was that disruptive to their business to not be able to get pallets when they needed it. And the types of pallets, it's a custom product, so they had certain types of criteria they needed for their pallets. I just found that interesting. Like, you just wouldn't have heard that 3 years ago. I feel like it was such a pretty eye-opening moment for me when we saw that from our client.
Right. Because I think about it because I'm in Jacksonville, Florida. And so there's parts of Jacksonville. I think you can probably say this for a lot of areas of the globe. There's parts of areas of town where it's big city, but then you just drive, 30 minutes in one direction and it's all countryside. Countryside, these pallets are typically used for bonfires. So people would have parties and bring in all these pallets and burn, they were free. Stores couldn't give them away, and they're just throwing them outside by the dumpster, and then they become this crazy commodity, where I think the craziest price I heard was like thousands of dollars for one pallet. And I'm like, gosh, imagine being in the pallet business. So that's a great story that they just went out and just bought a pallet company.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know, like, if they're selling the pallets to their competitors or if they've sort of closed it off to where it's just for themselves. I think they're still.
It would be smart if they did.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Have premium pricing to your competitors. Well, good. So there was another question I wanted to pull up here that I thought was interesting. I lost it here. Bear with me. I lost it here. The good news is we're getting a lot of questions. The bad news
Yeah,
is
it's a
that,
lot of good questions.
yeah. Um, let me ask you this. I don't want to put you too much on the spot if this isn't an area that you have a good answer for. If you don't, I'll try to take a stab at it. This is from Kyler, who's actually our podcast host, listening in the background here. She asked, when we talk about new tech and logistics, how have you seen best of breed solutions evolve in supply chain management? So in other words, rather than being dependent on like your traditional old school ERP systems to sort of manage everything for an organization, are you seeing supply chain technologies, sort of those focused supply chain technologies that specialize just in that? Do you think that is that sort of a trend you're seeing, or do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a really good question and a little outside of my wheelhouse because I really have I guess a more awareness around what the freight companies are using, maritime companies are using. So it's not really and maybe that's where you could maybe help shed some light on this because from a global supply chain perspective, from the logistics perspective, it's really about these companies. You have a TMS, so a transportation management software. You have a WMS, a warehouse management software. You even have, yard management softwares and things like that. But a lot of these different platforms, they are really trying to be a lot of things. And I could speak from like the marketing and sales perspective because a lot of these platforms claim they have, good marketing and sales components to them. A lot of them are crap. And I have no problem saying that because I've worked in these platforms myself. It's been a few years since I've been, elbows deep in a lot of these different solutions, but a lot of them from the people I talk to, they don't talk well to each other. And I'm assuming that exists a lot in supply chain management as well, because in the logistics area, it would be incredibly difficult to find a WMS that is also a really good TMS or a TMS that also has a really good, YMS component. They're either building it themselves and then just shutting everything else off around them. So there were two technologies that came into the space, I would say probably about 10 years ago, because the ELD mandates came through for a lot of truck drivers. You have to have these electronic logs that are built into the trucks. So a lot of different technology solutions were building for ELDs. And instead, what they should have probably been building for is API integrations. And so API integrations, for folks who don't know, is just basically a stream of data of how you program your own data. So then that way you can plug and play with other data solutions. API integrations, I feel like, are only just, another, I guess, thing we're only scratching the surface of what these API components can do. Because, from my experience, I've worked in home building, I've worked in, obviously with, sports and entertainment and things like that, where the data connections are just so seamless. And in this space, they're not seamless. You really have to really have a team of skilled developers. And that's primarily what I'm seeing now, is that a lot of the bigger logistics companies on the freight side of things, they are really investing heavily into where you were lucky 10 years ago to have a developer on staff in-house. Now these companies are having 10, 20, 30 developers all within the building that can be able to create solutions on the fly. And they are building their own their own API integrations for their own software, and then kind of shutting everyone else out. So they're building their own silos. So as if silos didn't already exist, in the transportation space, where you have, port workers that are going on strike, warehouse workers that don't want to work 24/7, truck drivers who don't want to work 24/7. There's all those individual silos. We're still seeing those in the technology space as well. But with the adoption, or the more so adoption of API technologies, I think we're going to see that stress alleviate a little bit, where there is more data sharing and there is more accurate, data sharing via API integrations. I would imagine that a lot of that is the same with supply chain software overall. But I would love to hear, your experience on if those data communications exist.
Yeah, they do. They're definitely getting easier to have that data communication and that integration between systems. So having multiple systems that specialize in certain things that can't be everything to everyone, is a lot more reasonable today than it was 10 or 20 years ago. So I think the good news is organizations have options. If you want to look for that one size fits all single solution that maybe doesn't do everything great, but it does do everything to some degree, you could go look at a traditional ERP system, or there's other options with what, like you mentioned, the warehouse management, the transportation management, the yard management, all these different systems that can specialize and do one thing really well. And this is actually another comment sort of building on this from Ghassan on LinkedIn. He says the days of MRP could be on a decline, forecasts are inaccurate, causing a cascading effect throughout the entire supply chain. ERP/MRP systems need to be more agile and provide a bit of intelligence to the end users. And I think that's well said. I think forecasting and you kind of mentioned sales and marketing and how that ties into forecasting. Organizations generally need to do a better job of that. And I think that's the other thing, is that things were a lot more predictable before the pandemic. I think you could sort of, demand was more predictable, supply was more predictable, your trading partners were more predictable. You didn't have all these curveballs like ports, containers getting stuck on ports for weeks at a time, that sort of thing. So how do you think do you think technology can help solve a lot of those problems, like the challenges that you've talked about so far?
Yes, but I think it requires more collaboration. And I think from not just from the people or not just from the technology standpoint, from the people standpoint. Because what I see, especially at a lot of like the higher executive level, is that they are buying the fancy, the shiny object syndrome. They're buying the fancy software thinking it's going to solve all of their problems. But in reality, it's because they didn't have the conversation with the in the trenches employees of the people who are using that software every day, that they didn't have that conversation ahead of time. They didn't have that, an implementation conversation with those, I'll use freight brokers, for example. When we, as a company years ago, when we made the decision to switch TMS providers, it was frankly a shit show. And it was one of those things where the TMS did not have the capabilities to provide accounting data. The accounting department relies on, knowing which companies have really good credit, knowing which companies, that you can extend the billing date out, which companies that need to prepay, which companies that need to pay within 30 days. A lot of those components did not exist in this TMS. And so for a lot of folks, it just put a strain on the entire accounting department. The brokers who are actually using and booking the freight on the platform were just miserable. They went from booking something like 100 loads a day to a little over 40. And so that has a lot of downstream effects. And it was probably ultimately one of the decisions that led to the ultimate, collapse of the business. We were an asset-based company, and being an asset-based company, a lot of companies know, especially if you run trucks, that if you have a truck go down, that's probably a $50,000 part. You're losing the revenue on that truck if it was running properly. So you're facing the downtime costs, you're facing the repair costs, and then you're not really using that to the best of your advantage. So for a lot of these different things, they can add up really quickly, and technology in the space is not cheap. And so when you're devoting a budget and a certain amount of time, I think that that's where a lot of the gaps are happening in this space, is that you're not talking to the folks who are actually going to be using the software before you make that purchase. And you need to know how your folks are getting the job done today and where it can be optimized. Because ultimately, if you do create that conversation and you have those conversations, then you know what steps in the process that you can actually optimize, that you can automate. A lot of times these freight companies, they'll take somebody right fresh out of college, they'll sit them down at a desk and tell them to make 100 cold calls in a day. And that has been the business model, I think, for a lot of, talking about freight brokerages in particular here, but that's been the business model, I think, for a lot of these companies for years. And only now, with the adoption of more technology and the adoption of more communication strategies, are they now seeing the value and making sure that those all operate in a cohesive environment, in a circular environment. Because if they don't, then if one of those components goes down, it could be the detriment and could be the loss of your business.
Yeah, absolutely. It's well said, for sure. Okay, we're here playing a clip of Blythe Brumleve chatting with me about the future of supply chain and logistics. We're going to continue the conversation, but first we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. Hi, this is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we recently hosted our Digital Stratosphere 2022 virtual event. It's 3 days of packed content related to digital transformation best practices, about 16 or 18 different workshops and different speakers that are presenting on different topics, everything you need to know about transformation. The bad news is if you miss that event, the event's over. The live event already happened. But the good news, if you've missed it, or even if you did attend it and you want to see replays or you want to catch the sessions you missed, you can do that now by going to stratosphere2022.com. Go to stratosphere2022.com, register. All you have to do is put in your name and email address, just a few fields. You get immediate access to all the recordings. And the recordings cover everything from digital strategy, software selection, organizational change, process improvement, architecture, data migration, cloud, trends in the industry, how to avoid failure, some of the legal aspects to think about, contractual aspects to think about as it relates to your transformation. All that is stuff that you'll get by registering for Stratosphere 2022 Replay. And again, go to stratosphere2022.com and you can listen to all the replays of all the workshops that you might have missed at the event. So hope you check it out, and thanks for listening. We'll see you soon. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 98. My name is Eric Kimberling, and we're here with Blythe Brumleve talking about the future of supply chain management and logistics. I wanted to pull up a comment here from Anders. Here it is. From Anders Green on LinkedIn. He says he can confirm we're still getting wood pallets all the time. Once we get up to 1 to 200, we post on Craigslist for folks to come and get them at no cost. At least 25% of them go to regular people who are doing bonfires or home projects.
Yes.
So if you need pallets, just look up Anders Green on LinkedIn and connect with him there. It sounds like he might be able to get you some pallets. So it's interesting to hear that data point or sort of validation of what we were talking about earlier.
I remember trying to, because we were doing an office remodel at one point, and we, especially with a lot of these freight brokerage floors, the desk and the floor environment is really important to have a cool look to it. And so I proposed to my boss that we have pallet desk, and he laughed me out of the business. And I thought it would just be so cool, have different pallet stacks, and then you put a piece of glass on top of them. I didn't really quite think it through, what the amount of times that brokers slam their phones down, I imagine that would probably be a mess. But I thought it looked really cool. So pallets are multifunctional. They can be furniture, they can be bonfire wood, they can ship your goods.
Yeah,
there's a lot of things you can do with a pallet.
Multi-purpose for sure, clearly, and bonfires, of course. And then this is an interesting comment from Sam Graham again. And actually, this, I think, points to an even bigger topic of discussion here. Maybe I'll spin this into a question. But Sam says some companies are forecasting demand at the wrong level of the bill of material, and companies are also sometimes stock at the wrong level. So they're forecasting at the wrong level. And so I think it sort of touches on really the sorts of changes that the supply chain and partners within the supply chain are going through in terms of technology, but also just rethinking how they do business and how they go about forecasting or how they go about building safety stock or whatever it is. I mean, I think companies have to really rethink their processes and the behaviors and the technologies that maybe challenge the status quo of how things had worked for those 30 years of smoothly running global supply chains. Now all of a sudden you have to kind of rethink some of those things. Is that something you're saying as well?
Yeah, because I think for a lot of companies, the supply chain, executive or the person in charge of managing the flow of your goods never had a seat in the boardroom or never had a seat at the executive meeting each week. Now they have a seat at those meetings. And so they can share what they're finding and what they're seeing, because like I said, it affects, up to 40% of your overall revenue is going towards transportation costs. So why wouldn't you, try to find ways to optimize that process? And I think for a lot of these companies, what we're seeing now is that you have some of the smartest minds and some of the brightest minds that are trying to predict what consumer behavior is going to do. And in reality, we really don't know. We're 2 years, quote unquote, or really only even a few months removed from the biggest shakeup in our consumer behavior patterns. Are we working from home? Are we traveling? Are we flying more? Are we driving more? And so a lot of those consumer purchases that were made a year ago, a lot of those purchases are still sitting in, or not from the consumer side of things, but from the business side of things. A lot of those shipments are still sitting in a warehouse, waiting to be used. I think I read that last year, the container ships that were waiting to dock and waiting to come to port or come to call, were sitting out there for so long that Halloween and Christmas shipments weren't being offloaded until January of this year. And so it's incredible to think about how all that merch has to go somewhere. So either you're liquidating it or you're storing it and waiting for this upcoming season. And so I think for a lot of companies, they're going to start, storage is already incredibly difficult to source and to find right now. So speaking from the United States perspective, but I think it's going to be interesting that after this holiday season, what those purchasing decisions look like, because we're still dealing with warehouses that are overfilled, stored to capacity. And what does that consumer purchasing behavior look like for this upcoming holiday season, especially as, people are starting to get more out into the world, or maybe they're not getting back out into the world. Maybe they're trying to save money. Recession is here. So there's a lot of, different things going on in the consumer area that, some of the smartest people on the planet are trying to figure out where this is going. And we really have no idea because we're going off of, unforeseen territory.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes total sense. And here's a question that I find interesting too. There's actually a couple questions sort of related to this one that have come from the audience. And this one is from Cha-Cha on YouTube. Asks, I think the question was, can we predict uncertainties like port shutdowns, container load delays, etc.? And apparently, I think they had asked the question earlier and we didn't get to it. But what can organizations realistically, especially, and I guess here's where I struggle with supply chain management in general, is you had sort of the extreme impact that the pandemic had on supply chain management a couple years ago, and now it's sort of settling into something more longer term, it seems like, but it's still changing. It's like you can't just respond and try to maybe overcorrect from what we needed 2 years ago, right when the pandemic first happened. But can organizations realistically do you see organizations getting a better handle on anticipating some of these disruptions a little bit better and using data and better processes, or diversifying their vendor partners like you mentioned before? Are you seeing any of this have a material impact on organizations just getting better at anticipating those challenges?
Anticipating them is always going to be a challenge because of the way of the nature that the US supply chain is structured. I mentioned earlier that every aspect of our industry works in a silo. So you have, port workers on the West Coast that are unionized. You have a lot of the rail networks that are unionized. A lot of trucking companies are not unionized. A lot of warehouses are not unionized. I can't think of one, sort of off the top of my head. And so what you have is a situation where you're trying to predict things that, have unpredictable components to them. Whether there's the Port of Oakland that, had their, the drivers went on strike at the Port of Oakland. And so none of the drivers are going in, and none of the owner operators are going in and out, but the port union workers or the port union drivers are still showing up to work. So you have a situation like that in particular, where you maybe can predict that, hey, they're going to have a protest and they're going to shut down for a week. So that's up to you to be paying attention to the news, to be able to diversify your solutions, to diversify your different offerings. And what does that take? More networking, more communication. You have to communicate back to your customer what the hell is just going on. And you're trying to figure it all out in a very small amount of time. So while we can, react, I think that's where, the majority of this industry is evolving, is that we're trying to get to a proactive place, but none of the components really exist to make it as, proactive as we would like. So that's where the building the communications and diversifying your offerings really comes into play. I was interviewing with one woman who's a freight forwarder, and she was responsible for getting her customers' items into port and ultimately getting them from the port to the porch. And because of the backlog on the West Coast ports, she actually rerouted the entire shipment to a port in northeastern Canada. And so that was obviously a little bit longer of a trek that her customer wanted to have for the shipment of goods. But ultimately, they ended up getting offloaded much quicker than if she were to just kind of wait it out on the West Coast. And so I think that you have to be creative. You have to think outside of the box. Working in logistics and supply chain, you have to have your main ethos is to be a problem solver. And if you're not working to solve those problems, we can't forecast every problem that's going to arise. Ultimately, it's up to you to be able to build those different solutions and to see trends and to build those solutions based off of those trends. And if, XYZ happens at this port, which I think they might because they just passed this law, then we need to be able to have backup solutions in case, our freight needs to be moved to the East Coast or moved to the Gulf or moved to another part of the world.
Yeah, yeah, that's super interesting, and it reminds me of certain types of technology that's out there now that I've learned more about over the last couple of years, like technologies that'll help you collect data points, not internal supply chain data points, but macro and external data points about like the financial viability of a supply chain provider. Or you mentioned union versus non-unionized. It's fairly safe to assume that a union sort of shop might be a higher risk of disruption than one that's non-unionized. Certainly cost, we have always looked at cost and quality. I suppose that's always been a pretty common set of criteria, but that's still in there as well. That's more of that internal metric. But it seems like organizations now are having to be smarter about just thinking about where's the risk. Do we have too much concentration of risk geographically in an area where there's geopolitical risk or weather-related risk, that sort of thing? It seems like we just need to get smarter as organizations and use the tools and data around us, maybe in different ways to really get a handle on being as accurate as possible in our forecasts.
And I think for a lot of these data tools too, it's not just that they're a data solution. It's where are they getting their data from? Who are their data partners? A lot of these different solutions, they have to, especially from a data perspective, they have to partner with the companies that are actually moving the freight in order to get access to that data. And a lot of times these companies don't want to share their proprietary data, so you're operating off of a limited pool of sources. And then once you have that data, how do you make it actionable? And I think for a lot of companies, that's where a bigger problem is starting to arise, is that yes, we have all of these tools and these solutions and all of this data, but how do we make it actionable? How do we actually do something with all of the information that we have at hand? Because it's not just, as you mentioned, it's not just from the technology side of things, but it's also from geopolitical risk and what's going on in the world. We have to pay attention to all of these different news sources and then be able to act proactive, or I guess reactively, based on all of those different information points in order to be proactive for our customers.
Yeah, absolutely. That's well said for sure. Um, what so you touched on this a little bit, but maybe I'll ask it more explicitly so we can kind of focus on this thread a bit. But a lot of you've talked about how a lot of your focus with digital dispatch is on helping logistics providers market themselves more effectively. Why is this so important in the world of supply chain and logistics? Why is this focus on marketing? Why is that so important?
Well, really, you have the opportunity to be a big fish in a little pond. And it feels weird calling, supply chain and logistics, multi-trillion-dollar industry that powers the entire globe. It feels weird calling that a small pond, right? But there
Right.
frankly just aren't that many people creating content in this industry specific to what your, role and responsibilities and what your company provides. And so I think that there's just a massive opportunity. And we've kind of touched on this earlier, where a lot of these companies, they were reliant on going to the conferences, going to the trade shows, and being able to make those connections and have those conversations in a one-on-one environment. But now, with social media, for example, you have the opportunity to have a keynote speak, or have a keynote opportunity to be able to speak on the topic that you are passionate about every single day, 24 hours a day, and it works for you 24 hours a day. And so what we're seeing now is more companies are starting to recognize the strength in talking about their businesses, the things that they care about that are, sort of adjacent to their business. All of these different aspects that, you would typically put on your website, or you would typically put in a brochure and maybe talk about it at a conference. Now you have the ability to have that keynote stage every single day. And so only a limited amount of companies are actually partaking in this. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, especially as more media companies are growing in this space. And so when you have more media companies, you're getting asked to go on more podcasts, you're getting asked to go on more interviews, you're digesting more content from this space. And so if you're looking around and you're seeing what's going on, I mean, it just makes perfect sense to me of why you would need to want to be in front of that stage. You want to be on that stage. You want to be screaming from the mountaintop of the solutions that your business provides. And I just think that it's such an incredibly, I would say, slow to adopt in this industry. It's been a massive opportunity for a while now. It still is, and for the foreseeable future, as long as we're putting our attention online, there's an opportunity for you to capture that attention and ultimately, bring that person to become more aware about you as a person, what you care about, what your business problems solve. And then that way, when they come to the buying decision, they know who you are, they know the solutions that you provide, and they will come to you before they ever go search for a competitor in Google, before they ever send out an RFP. They come to you because they know what you stand for. Because at the end of the day, people do business with people, and we can have all of this technology and all this different functionality and all this data to sort of parse through. Can I trust you with my freight? That is the ultimate decision that people are making every single day of the week. Can I trust you that if stuff hits the fan, that you're going to figure out a way to problem solve it? And ultimately, social media gives you the advantage to be able to proclaim that message of how you handle difficulties, how you handle problems, and communicate that effectively to an audience that may not be ready to buy now and get your services now, but they will be over time, especially if you educate them over time. Anywhere from, I think a lot of folks, they try to get started on LinkedIn. I'm going to post every day on LinkedIn for 2 months. And then they quit LinkedIn after 2 months and 2 leads. And it's like, no, you're just barely getting started. Think about it as, a content snowball effect, where if you consistently put your message out there, you are marketing yourself to 95% of the business world that isn't ready to buy. So that when they do become part of that 5% that they are ready to buy, you win before that person ever gets to Google. That's the ethos of sort of the communication strategy that I preach, that I follow myself, and that I help other companies refine and define. And then it all really routes back to your website. Do you have a way to capture attention through social media? And then do you have a way to create that attention, create that demand for your skills and services on social media? And then do you have a way to capture that attention? So are you booking meetings on your site? Or do you have a way for people to request a quote, to contact you? I'm very, very passionate about building on land that you own. So your website, your podcast, your email list, and also land that you rent. So social media, for example. I think you have to have both of those in today's world. And there's only a small percentage. I would say 5% maybe of companies, of supply chain and logistics companies, that are taking advantage of the everyday keynote that you can give. And I think 5% is being too generous.
Yeah. Well, and it's such a critical time for supply chain providers too, because it is a time where I think it's somewhat unprecedented, where you have a lot of organizations that are rethinking and replanning, redesigning their supply chains, which inherently suggests that there could be different partners or new partners entering the equation, that people are out there looking for alternatives to what is broken. And so it's a great opportunity for these organizations to be top of mind, when they are ready, when their customers are ready to make that sort of a decision, for sure. So just sort of a capstone question, sort of tie this all together, everything we've talked about so far. What advice would you give to an organization that's about to embark on a supply chain improvement initiative? Like any kind of closing summary words of advice to an organization that's really trying to rethink their supply chain and being better at supply chain management?
I think that the most underutilized aspect of this would be having conversations with your customers. That is the driver of every other aspect, or should be the driver of every other aspect of your business. The kind of how you communicate to future prospects would rely off of those conversations with your customers, finding out those trigger points of what made them pick up the phone and call you, what made them come to your site and convert to become a lead. The conversations with your customers is something that I don't think happens it happens a lot from a transactional standpoint. Where is my freight going? How, trying to source different components, procurement. A lot of those conversations are transactional in that sense, but they're not at a deeper level. How are you making the lives of your customers better on a daily, weekly, monthly basis? And then how can you take those conversations and then package them in a way that you can either use that insight, use that market research to communicate to other like-minded businesses that are in their same area or in their same field or commodity, and then using those conversations in order to market the rest of your business. Because from customer conversations, you can just really just drive so much more. And I'm not just talking about surveys, that you send out in an email and you have somebody fill out, a 20-question survey. Those are important for getting a massive amount of information, but prioritizing having, at least weekly conversations with your customers, maybe monthly if their time, is a little limited to have a weekly conversation, but having those separate conversations that are separate from the transactional conversations that you're having to go in on a much deeper level. And even, if you wanted to take it even a step further, having like a customer interview series where you turn that into content, and then you have that content and you have your customer on camera talking about how your solution helped them. That is a gold mine for your marketing. Now you know the exact verbiage of what your customer is using, not the jargon that you use day in and day out with your team and your employees, because for a lot of companies, our jargon is foreign to them. You might as well be speaking a different language. But now because of those customer conversations, the exact verbiage of what they're using. So then you can use that exact verbiage to talk to your other customers, to talk to your prospects, to convey that messaging in all of your marketing. It really has just an incredible downstream effect by simply having those in-depth conversations with your customers.
And I love how you gave an answer to my question, and then you tied it back to marketing. That was brilliant. So because it all ties back to, and you're right, it does tie together. It's a great idea if you're listening to your customers and learning what their needs are and how you can build your supply chain in a way that's going to better meet the needs of the customers, and at the same time, while you're at it, creating marketing content that's going to allow you to market yourself to your potential customers. That's even better.
It's really firsthand market research, because a lot of this market research just doesn't exist unless you maybe, trust the research reports that come out of like Gartner or McKinsey, those types of studies. But there's no better case study than talking to the people that you're already working with.
Yeah.
You're gonna drive so much value and so much information from those conversations, and the incredible downstream effects that it has will likely set your business up for success for years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good. Well, this has been a great conversation. I know we could go on, and maybe at some point we will. Well, maybe I'll have a part 2 of this conversation and go deeper into some of these topics. But really appreciate you being here today. How do people, maybe just tell us one more time, how do we get a hold of you? What's your website? How do we connect with you? What's the best way to reach you?
Sure. So I'm a content creator in, supply chain and logistics space. So I have some projects that I work on the content side of things. But my main business is digitaldispatch.io. If you want to find, sort of just a list of all of my work, social media accounts, things like that, you can visit everythingislogistics.com. It's kind of like, for those folks who are familiar with like Linktree or, a site like that, I pretty much just built my own. And so everythingislogistics.com is where like all my social media handles are, the content projects I've worked on. And then of course, solutions at Digital Dispatch. And appreciate you inviting me on today. The discussion was awesome. The comments were great. And the questions were even better.
All right. Thank you, Blythe. Great conversation. And it's good to hear it for a second time. And for those of you that hadn't heard it before, hopefully you picked up some good takeaways. And if you did catch it earlier in the podcast or earlier in the season, hopefully you picked up some additional nuggets there. And we're going to chat through some of the takeaways and findings when we come back from a quick break. But first, we'll take that break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the ever-changing landscape of digital transformation? Then you need our newly released 2023 Digital Transformation Report. This comprehensive report covers the latest trends, technologies, and strategies to ensure your digital transformation is optimized for success. The 2023 Digital Transformation Report is packed full of proven methodologies and insights from experts in the independent digital transformation field. You'll also receive practical insights on how to implement digital transformation strategies within your unique organization. This free report is available for download on our website at thirdstage-consulting.com under our thought leadership section.
Bad to the bone, bad to the bone, bad.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 98. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. We just had Blythe Brumleve on the show talking about the future of supply chain management and logistics. What were some of your takeaways, and maybe tell us why that was in your top three of the top three interviews of 2022, Kyler?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just fascinated by the logistics. If you don't follow Blythe, specifically on LinkedIn, I highly recommend it because weekly she'll take you through a different process that you never even thought of around the logistics of how you do that. The other day she did an NFL game, the National Football League here in the United States, how they actually produced the game. And it was absolutely fascinating. I had no idea
really?
all of that goes into that. And I think that's the fundamental piece of this conversation is understanding and kind of lifting the veil around logistics and the overall industry. And not only that, but the opportunities for technology to kind of increase the efficiencies of logistics. But again, like we talked about with Chris, until you have a really clean operating model, a clean strategy around your supply chain and logistics, then there's no way, you can get your product on a ship to your customer in the quality that you want, in the time that you want, unless you've really mapped all that out and been intentional about that.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, it's especially as complex as supply chains are. I mean, you talk about an NFL production or producing a big sporting event. That's complex, but global supply chains are super complicated just in terms of all the moving parts, especially when you start looking at raw materials and sub-assemblies and distributing across multiple countries. And then once it gets to the port, you've got to get it through customs and then onto a ship or a truck to get it shipped to whatever location. And then it's just there's just a lot of moving parts that go into it. And that's part of why it's so fascinating.
It is fascinating. I think there's a piece to me that speaks to in the pandemic, the creativity of businesses. If, we could ever find a silver lining out of such a traumatic time within the world, we really did see innovation at its top tier, specifically in supply chain. It really helps when you have the capital to buy a barge and move it around the United States. That probably helps. But at the same time, you saw businesses really look to get creative so they could service the customer. And that's something that I hope that customer-centric focused and that piece of there are no bad ideas when it comes to supply chain and that visibility into it that businesses have been forced into that transformation that they continue to look at, because that's really going to optimize the overall customer experience as well as the growth of the business in understanding the supply chain. Because like you said earlier, when it comes to all the different systems that people have, sometimes they don't know. Sometimes they don't know anything about their supply chain, especially the executive team. And having that forced visibility into how do you logistically get your product from raw materials, production, distribution into your customers' hands. How does that work and how can you optimize that?
Yeah. And what are your priorities too? That's another
Sure.
way that organizations need to be, or that leaders within organizations need to be aligned is our focus on efficiency and cost, or is it on minimizing, not outages, but gosh, I'm drawing a blank. Disruption, or when you can't fill a customer order or whatever that's called. There's a word for it that I'm just drawing a complete blank on, probably because I'm over buzzworded out
Yeah, I know
from that first opening hot topic segment from earlier. So now I can't think of like the real words.
Too much exposure. Yeah, absolutely.
Too many buzzwords. But yeah, so having those sorts of disruptions or stock outages or just not being able to fulfill customer demand, that might be more important than cost and efficiency. And, just aligning on what those priorities are in a supply chain is very important.
And I think for us, we're so mission driven when it comes to transparency. We've really seen that as an evolution within the supply chain industry and specifically vendors. You're allowed to renegotiate your contracts. You're allowed to diversify, your overall vendors and suppliers that you work with. You're allowed to think outside the box. And just like in the software industry, so much of it traditionally has been, you have a box business, you need to fit in our box, as opposed to, looking at what's best for the actual business and customer needs. So I think that just, plagues at my heartstrings when it comes to those different pieces of transparency and overall integrity in the business, to focus on the most important people, which is the customer and then the overall employee.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's a good way to look at it for sure. Well, good. Well, good conversation, and thank you for your top three. We'll have our top 10 countdown of the top 10 interviews of 2023. We'll or of 2022. We'll play some clips from those here in an upcoming episode, so stay tuned for that. We're tentatively planning on episode number 100, so 2 weeks from today is sort of what we're planning. But the show's pretty loose. We tend to roll with the punches. There might be a big topic we just have to cover that takes precedence. So we'll see how things unfold. But at some point here, we will, in the next couple of weeks, we'll have a countdown of the top 10 interviews, so you can get little clips and bite-sized nuggets of some of those interviews you may have missed throughout the season. And if you want to check out any past interview, including you picked your 3, but there's 50 plus that you didn't pick as your top, your favorite, Kyler, and others might find value in those conversations too. So you can go back and check those out in some of the past episodes throughout the year. So be sure to check that out. So I want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you, Kyler, for a great show. Thank you to our guests, Chris King and Blythe Brumleve, to talk about supply chain and finance transformations. It was great to have them on the show. Check us out every Wednesday, new episodes. Leave us a review, subscribe, share it with your colleagues. We'd love to get the word out to as many people as possible. So if you find value in it, please be sure to share it with your colleagues. So hope you all have a great week. We will see you next week on the next episode of Transformation Ground Control. Take care.